What if death wasn't the end, but a beginning? Beneath the surface of life and loss lies a hidden truth that could change everything we know about resurrection and the souls that linger between. Ethan sat at his desk, fingers tracing the edge of the yellowed manuscript in front of him. The room around him was filled with stacks of books, relics from long-forgotten civilizations, all neatly arranged, waiting to be studied. But today, his mind was elsewhere. It had been months since his mother's passing, and the question that had nagged at him since that day refused to leave. Will the cremated rise again? He had never thought much about death, let alone resurrection. His work as an archaeologist had always been grounded in the tangible, the empirical, the world of artifacts and ancient stones. But now, with his mother's ashes in a modest urn on the mantel, that question seemed to linger like smoke in the air. His mother had chosen cremation, a decision that had once seemed so practical, so unremarkable. Yet, as he stared at the urn, something deep inside him questioned whether there was more to the process than simply reducing the body to ash. Could there be something else beyond the finality of fire? He found himself drawn to ancient texts, religious and mythological, searching for any reference to the cremated, to the souls of those reduced to nothing more than smoke. Was the act of cremation truly the end? Or was there a possibility of resurrection, of the dead rising once again? In some form, the libraries he had combed through, the vast archives of ancient knowledge, had offered him little comfort. He had seen 1,000 interpretations of the afterlife, from the eternal peace promised by the Egyptians to the more obscure rituals of forgotten tribes. But none had ever really questioned the finality of death in the way he did now. What happens to those whose bodies are consumed by fire? Ethan had never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. His mind was a vault of reason and logic, built on the firm foundation of scientific inquiry. But something about the question, so deeply personal, had stirred a curiosity he couldn't ignore. And so, like any archaeologist, he dug deeper, finding himself not just searching for answers about the ancient world, but confronting a question that had suddenly become very real for him. He packed his things that evening, a quiet resolve settling in his chest. He would travel the world if he had to, uncovering old truths, deciphering ancient languages, until he found an answer. The remnants of his mother's ashes would no longer sit on the mantel, gathering dust. He would uncover the truth, the hidden truth that had been lost for centuries. The cremated might indeed rise again, but only if he could unearth the key to their return. Ethan's journey took him to a forgotten corner of the world, a library tucked away in the shadows of a crumbling cathedral. The scent of old wood and damp stone filled the air as he walked past rows of decaying shelves, their contents barely visible under layers of dust. He had heard rumors of this place, a hidden archive containing manuscripts that had long since been overlooked by the world. It was here, among forgotten texts, that Ethan hoped to find the answer that had haunted him for so long. His fingers traced the edges of a leather-bound volume, its surface cracked with age. The book was heavier than he had anticipated, and when he opened it, the faint smell of ink and parchment filled his nostrils. The script inside was unlike anything he had seen before, an ancient form of Greek mixed with symbols he could barely comprehend. His heart quickened. This was it, the moment he had been searching for. There, nestled among obscure myths and fragmentary verses, were the first hints of a hidden truth that spoke of death and resurrection, of souls returning from the ashes. As he pored over the fragile pages, Ethan's eyes widened. The manuscript described a forgotten tradition from an early civilization, one that had been wiped away by time. The text spoke of a ritualistic rebirth, of those whose bodies were consumed by fire being reborn in a different form, a new existence, though never quite the same as before. The phrase that caught his attention was simple, yet profound. From ash to flame, from flame to sky. The more he read, the more the words seemed to resonate with his own question, echoing his deepest fears and hopes. He recognized some of the symbols, ones he had seen in the ancient ruins he had visited, but others were entirely new. They seemed to speak of cycles, of transformation beyond the physical. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the manuscript was more than just a record of ancient rituals. It was a key, a clue to something far more profound. He spent the following weeks combing through similar texts, tracing the faint thread of connection between them. The concept of resurrection was nothing new, but these references to fire and ashes were rare, almost forgotten. In one forgotten corner of a Babylonian text, he found a cryptic passage about the Ashen Gate, a portal that would open for those whose bodies had been reduced to nothing but dust. The words were vague, but the implication was clear. There was more to death than the finality of fire. The cremated might not be lost forever after all. As Ethan connected the dots, he began to see a pattern emerging, a concept that spanned cultures, civilizations, and time. Every text he uncovered hinted at something larger than life, something that transcended the physical realm. But what was it? Was there truly a hidden truth buried beneath the ashes? And if so, was he the one meant to uncover it? The question weighed on him with increasing urgency, and with each discovery, the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed began to fall into place. Ethan wasn't sure why he had agreed to meet Isabella. Perhaps it was the growing restlessness within him. Or maybe it was the allure of someone who claimed to understand the very mysteries he was trying to unravel. As an archaeologist, he had spent his life dismissing spiritualism, seeing it as nothing more than superstition. But something about the hidden texts, the references to death and rebirth, had sparked a new curiosity, one he couldn't shake. She was waiting for him in a small, dimly lit room, the air thick with the scent of incense. Isabella's presence was calming, yet there was an intensity to her, a quiet power that seemed to draw Ethan in. Her eyes, deep and knowing, met his without hesitation, and he felt an unspoken connection between them, as if she had already seen the questions he carried in his heart. "I know what you seek," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed in the stillness of the room. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, surprised by her knowing words. He hadn't spoken a single word about his search for answers, yet somehow she seemed to understand. "I've seen the veil between worlds," Isabella continued, her gaze drifting as if recalling something from a distant dream. "I've walked where the living fear to tread, and I've glimpsed what lies beyond death. The cremated, they do rise again, in a form you can scarcely comprehend." Ethan's skepticism flared, but he held his tongue, intrigued by her certainty. "And what is it that you believe happens after death?" he asked, unable to suppress his curiosity any longer. She paused, her eyes closing as if reaching deep within herself. "There are layers to existence. The physical world is only one of them. When a body is burned, the soul does not simply disappear. It moves through the fire, transforms, and enters a realm of waiting. Some call it the astral plane, others the spirit world. But the truth is, it is neither here nor there. It exists in between, a space where the essence of a person lingers, waiting for rebirth." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The words felt impossibly foreign. Yet there was an undeniable resonance within him. He thought of his mother, her ashes scattered into the wind, and the gnawing question that had haunted him for so long. Would she ever return? Isabella opened her eyes, locking them with his once more. "Your mother, Ethan, she is not lost. She waits, as all do. The cycle of life and death is eternal, and those who are cremated are not forgotten. They are part of the great dance, just as you are." A wave of emotion swept over Ethan, grief, hope, and a quiet, profound peace. He had always believed death to be an end. But now, sitting in that room, he began to wonder if it was only the beginning of something far greater than he had ever imagined. Ethan wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere between the ancient manuscripts and Isabella's cryptic words, he had found himself tangled in something far bigger than he could have imagined. The night had been uneventful until a soft knock at his door disturbed the stillness of his study. He opened it to find a man standing there, draped in a long, dark cloak, his face shadowed by the brim of a wide hat. His presence felt deliberate, purposeful. "I need to speak with you," the stranger said, his voice low but urgent. Ethan hesitated, scanning the man's eyes for any sign of a trick. But there was nothing. They were calm, intent on something far more significant than a casual conversation. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, already knowing the answer. The moment he spoke the words, he regretted them. He didn't need an introduction. There was something ancient about the man, something that screamed of hidden truths and long-buried knowledge. "The ones who seek the truth always find us," the man replied, his words almost a prophecy. "You've been searching, Ethan, for the answers to life's most profound questions, and we, too, have been searching for one like you." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest, but curiosity pushed him forward. "What do you want with me?" The man stepped inside, his presence almost overwhelming in the small room. He didn't seem to care for pleasantries. "There is an order, one that has guarded the truth of the afterlife for centuries. We've kept it hidden from the world, not out of malice, but to protect the fragile balance between the realms." Ethan swallowed hard. The weight of his words settled on him like a dense fog. "What truth?" The man pulled out a small, worn scroll from within his cloak, and as he unrolled it, the symbols inscribed upon it seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "We are known by many names: the custodians, the keepers, the silent witnesses. Our purpose is simple yet profound: to guard the knowledge of what happens after death, to preserve the sacred rites of passage, and to ensure that the veil between life and death remains intact." Ethan's pulse quickened. He felt the pull of something ancient, something that resonated deep within him. "And what do you know that I don't?" "Do you know that I don't?" he asked, almost whispering, as if afraid of the answer. The man's gaze softened for the first time. "You know more than you think, Ethan. You've felt it. The pull, the question. The answer you seek has always been there, waiting for you. It is not a question of if the cremated will rise again, but when, and more importantly, how." The room grew colder, the weight of his words pressing down on Ethan's chest. He had unknowingly stepped into something far larger than he had ever anticipated. The man took a step closer, his eyes intense with a silent understanding. "You're not alone in this search, and now, neither are we." Ethan stood frozen, his mind swirling with the implications. Ethan had spent countless hours in libraries, piecing together fragments of knowledge from ancient cultures, but he still found himself circling the same question. What was the true meaning behind cremation? It wasn't just about the process of reducing the body to ash, it was about what that act signified. As he sifted through texts detailing burial rites and embalming techniques, he became increasingly drawn to the stories of cultures that saw cremation not as an end, but as a final transformation, an act that prepared the soul for its next journey. One afternoon, he found himself in the depths of an old religious text from an obscure Hindu sect. The words leapt out at him. Cremation is the release of the soul's essence, the last tether to the earth before it rises to its next form. The idea was simple but profound. The body, in its earthly state, had to be destroyed to free the spirit. Ethan couldn't help but consider how this might connect to his mother's choice to be cremated. She had always talked about the idea of transformation in a way that suggested she believed in something more, something beyond mere physical death. Intrigued, Ethan decided to explore further. He traveled to the ancient city of Varanasi, where cremation has been performed for thousands of years along the banks of the Ganges. There, he met a local priest, a man whose face was a map of wisdom and age. The priest listened to Ethan's question in silence before responding with words that resonated deep within him. "The body is a vessel, my son," the priest said slowly. "When the vessel is no longer of use, it must be purified, made empty, to allow the spirit to escape. But the spirit does not disappear. It transforms, and in that transformation, it is prepared for its next journey." Ethan found himself considering the deeper layers of what he had learned. Cremation, he realized, wasn't just about finality, it was about freedom. The act of reducing the body to ashes was, in a sense, a symbolic act of liberation. There was a surrender in it, an acknowledgement that life and death were not as linear as he had always believed. As he sat on the steps leading down to the Ganges, watching the flames lick the air, he understood the ceremony's power. The fire that consumed the body was not simply destructive, it was transformative. The soul's connection to the physical realm was severed, and it was given the chance to transcend. The body, once held in earth, would now be scattered to the winds, its essence carried by the river's flow. In the days that followed, Ethan became obsessed with understanding why certain traditions saw cremation as a necessary step in the soul's evolution. He visited more temples, spoke with scholars, and found that the concept of purification through fire existed in countless cultures. He learned that fire wasn't just seen as an element of destruction, it was seen as the ultimate purifier, a force capable of revealing the soul's truest nature. The more he uncovered, the more Ethan began to realize that the process of cremation held a far deeper, spiritual significance. It was the final surrender of the body to the earth. But more importantly, it was the soul's first step toward transcendence, a transformation that couldn't happen without the release of the earthly form. This knowledge only deepened the mystery of what came next, and Ethan began to wonder if this ancient wisdom held the key to understanding whether the cremated truly could rise again. Ethan was in the middle of reviewing some ancient Egyptian burial practices when he first met Lena. She was sitting alone at a small cafe, her eyes distant, as though she were lost in thought. Her appearance was unremarkable, long dark hair, a simple black coat, but there was something about her that drew Ethan in, something that tugged at him like a magnetic pull. Perhaps it was the intensity in her gaze, or maybe it was just the loneliness he saw reflected in her eyes. He couldn't help but approach her. They spoke casually at first, sharing small talk about the weather, and soon, their conversation turned to his research. As he mentioned his latest findings on cremation, Lena's face changed, her expression darkening, her hands gripping her cup a little too tightly. She looked at him, and for the first time, she seemed to come back to the present moment, her gaze sharp and clear. "You're studying death," she said, her voice low but full of weight. "What do you think happens when someone dies?" Ethan hesitated. He had spent so many years trying to unravel the scientific perspective of the afterlife, always seeing it as something that could be explained through logic, biology, and physics. But there was something about the way she spoke, something raw and desperate, that made him falter. I believe the body decays, and the mind." He paused, unsure of how to finish his sentence. But Lena wasn't waiting for him to finish. "Do you believe the dead can still speak?" Her question was blunt, and it caught him off guard. He took a breath, gathering his thoughts. "No, not really. At least not in any concrete, verifiable way. There are stories, myths, but nothing definitive." Lena's eyes darkened once more, and for a moment, Ethan felt as though she were seeing something in him, something he couldn't quite grasp. Then she spoke again, her voice trembling, but only slightly. "My twin brother died 5 years ago. He's spoken to me, more than once." Her words hung in the air, charged with a quiet intensity. Not in the way you'd think. It wasn't through a dream or hallucination. He's communicated directly with me. I have proof. Ethan blinked, unable to comprehend the weight of what she was saying. His mind, a mind that had thrived on logic, on deciphering ancient texts with precision, stumbled to make sense of her claim. Lena pulled a small, worn notebook from her bag, flipping it open to show Ethan a series of cryptic symbols, written in the same familiar hand that he knew to be her brother's. She smiled, a sad, knowing smile. I didn't believe it either, at first, but then I began to understand. The dead don't always leave, not in the way we expect. A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine as he looked at the pages before him. He had never considered the possibility that the dead might remain, their voices reaching across the void in ways science couldn't explain. For the first time, his neatly ordered world seemed to crumble. Was it possible that there was something beyond the boundaries of death? Something that defied explanation? Ethan's skepticism wavered, and he felt the weight of Lena's story settle into him. His search for the truth had just entered a new, uncharted territory. The answers he had once believed so firmly in were no longer enough to explain what was happening here. The legend had always seemed like a fragment of forgotten folklore, something that might have been lost to time. But as Ethan, Lena, and Isabella sat together in the dimly lit room of the secret society's library, the pieces of the ancient puzzle began to fit together in a way he hadn't expected. They were poring over texts that dated back millennia, some of them barely legible. The ink faded and worn by centuries of neglect. Yet within these fragile pages lay the story of Artemis, the first person ever cremated and resurrected. Ethan had come across references to her before, bits and pieces in fragmented texts. References to a woman whose body was burned and who, against all odds, returned from the ashes. But now, with Lena and Isabella's help, he was beginning to piece together the full narrative. It wasn't just a simple story of resurrection. It was a story that had shaped the very understanding of life and death in ancient cultures. Artemis, as the texts told it, was not a divine figure, but a mortal woman, born in an age long before the established religious frameworks. She had been a priestess of a forgotten cult, dedicated to the worship of the unseen forces that governed the balance of life and death. Her followers believed that death was not an end, but a transformation, a shedding of the earthly form to allow the soul to evolve into something higher. When Artemis died, the usual rituals were performed. Her body was prepared, adorned with symbols of the eternal, and placed on the pyre. But there was something more in the story. As her body burned, a great storm rose over the horizon. The people gathered around the fire, witnessing something that would forever change their understanding of death. The flames swirled, twisting in unnatural shapes, and from the heart of the fire, her voice spoke. She was not gone. She had risen, not in the way the living would expect, but in a form that transcended the mortal realm. The first resurrection was not a return to the physical world. It was a transcendent rebirth, a soul elevated beyond the confines of the body. Artemis, in her new form, could not be touched by earthly hands. She became something else, an emissary, a bridge between the living and the dead. The flames had not destroyed her. They had purified and transformed her. The story of Artemis was passed down through generations, but it was obscured, buried beneath layers of mythology and theology. To the early cultures who revered her, she became a symbol of hope and renewal, a belief that the soul could never truly be extinguished, not even by fire. But over time, the true meaning of her resurrection was lost. People began to see it as a metaphor, a myth, rather than a tangible reality. As Ethan read through the texts, his mind raced. This wasn't just about the cremated rising again. It was about understanding death in its most profound form. The cremation had not been the end of Artemis. It had been the beginning of something far greater. The story didn't just answer a question, it opened up a new way of thinking about life, death, and the mysterious forces that connected them. Artemis had proven that the soul was not bound by the flesh, and in her resurrection, the first seed of the hidden truth had been planted. The journey to the Tomb of Souls was not one they had planned. Ethan, Lena, and Isabella had heard the stories, the whispers of a hidden place where the cremated bodies of those who had returned from the dead were said to rest. For centuries, it was believed to be a myth, a story passed down in hushed tones to ward off the curious. But the more Ethan delved into the ancient texts, the more it seemed that the tomb was real and its significance far greater than they had imagined. The tomb was located in a remote valley, far from any known civilization, and the landscape around it seemed almost otherworldly, as though nature itself had been shaped by forces beyond mortal comprehension. As they approached the tomb, the air grew thick with the weight of something ancient, a quiet that felt like it was waiting for something to happen. The entrance was barely visible, hidden beneath centuries of overgrowth and the crumbled ruins of forgotten structures. It was as though the earth had tried to bury it, but the tomb refused to be forgotten. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and old incense. The walls were lined with symbols and carvings, many of which seemed to shift and change as the group moved through the narrow corridors. Some of the symbols were familiar to Ethan from his studies, but others were strange and alien, as though they belonged to a language lost to time. At the heart of the tomb, they discovered a chamber, a vast, circular room with a stone altar at its center. Around the altar, the remains of bodies lay scattered, each one carefully preserved, their forms untouched by time. The bodies, it seemed, were not just remnants of the dead, they were the physical manifestation of something much more profound. There were no marks of decay, no signs of aging. Instead, they appeared as though they were simply waiting. As Lena knelt beside one of the bodies, she reached out to touch it, and Ethan felt a strange pull in the air, a shift in the energy that surrounded them. It was as though the tomb itself was alive, breathing in the knowledge they brought with them. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, and Ethan could hear whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, emanating from the walls. He couldn't make out the words, but the feeling was unmistakable. These were the voices of the returned. Lena's voice broke the silence. "They've come back, haven't they?" she asked, her tone filled with awe. "This is where they rest, where they wait." Ethan's mind raced. He had been skeptical, always searching for logical explanations. But standing here, surrounded by these bodies, the evidence was undeniable. There was something beyond the physical realm, something ancient, something powerful that connected death and resurrection in ways he had never considered. The Tomb of Souls wasn't just a place, it was a gateway, a door to understanding, to a truth that had been hidden for millennia. And as they stood there, in the heart of this forgotten place, Ethan realized that the journey they had embarked on was only just beginning. The mysteries of the tomb were only the beginning of a much larger question. Could the cremated truly rise again? Ethan sat in the dimly lit chamber, the air thick with an unsettling energy. The walls were lined with ancient scrolls and relics, each one carrying knowledge that seemed to pulse with a strange, hidden truth. The secret society had gathered here for centuries, its members sworn to protect a truth so powerful that it could alter the very fabric of existence. Now, they were revealing it to Ethan. They called it the laws of the soul. The head of the society, an elderly man with piercing eyes, stood before him, his voice low and measured as he spoke of forces beyond mortal comprehension. "These laws," he said, "are not merely beliefs or philosophies. They are the principles that govern the entire universe, the way life, death, and resurrection function. They are the fundamental rules of existence, woven into the very fabric of time and space. Ethan listened, his skepticism faltering with every word. He had spent his life searching for answers through research, through logic. But now he was hearing something entirely different. The society's leader spoke of a realm where life and death were not linear, where the soul could traverse realms, and where the true essence of resurrection was governed by forces beyond mortal understanding. The first law, the leader continued, is the law of essence. The soul, once created, is eternal. It may change, transform, and pass through many forms, but its essence remains intact. Death does not erase the soul. It is merely a transition, an opportunity for growth or decay. But the soul, in its purest form, is indestructible. Ethan absorbed this, the weight of the words settling into his bones. The implications were profound. If the soul was indeed eternal, if death was only a transformation, then what of cremation? What of the process that reduced the body to ash? Could the soul still transcend the ashes, still find a way to return? The second law, the leader went on, is the law of boundaries. The soul exists within certain boundaries, those of time, of space, of life and death. But these boundaries are not absolute. There are moments in time, moments of rare convergence, when the barriers between realms weaken. At these times, the soul has the opportunity to return, to rise again. This is why certain rituals, certain locations are sacred. They align with the natural flow of the universe, allowing the soul to transcend its earthly limitations. Ethan's mind reeled. This was what he had sensed in the Tomb of Souls, the shifting of boundaries, the delicate dance between realms. This was the hidden truth, the force that tied life and death together. The leader's voice grew softer, more reverent. The final law, he said, is the law of transmutation. The soul, through its journey, seeks transformation. It evolves, learns, and adapts. This is why resurrection, true resurrection, is not just about returning, it is about becoming something more, a greater understanding, a higher state of being. The room fell silent. Ethan could feel the weight of the laws pressing against him, their truth undeniable. The universe, he now understood, was not random. It had order, purpose, and a deeper meaning that had been hidden for millennia. And perhaps, just perhaps, the cremated could rise again. Not as they were, but as something greater, something transformed. The laws were not just ancient beliefs, they were the keys to understanding the very nature of existence. Ethan awoke in the dark, his heart racing. The world around him was still, save for the faint hum of the night air through the cracks in the window. But it wasn't the silence that lingered. It was the vivid images that had clung to him in his dreams. They were more than just dreams, really visions. Fragments of lives lived long before his own. Faces twisted in agony and ecstasy, eyes filled with sorrow and longing. The images were too real, too familiar, and they were all so disconnected from the life he knew. The sensation lingered even as he lay still in his bed. He had spent the better part of his adult life searching for rational answers to the great mysteries of life and death. Science, logic, history, those were his tools, his anchors. But now, something was slipping through the cracks, something he couldn't explain. In the darkness, he remembered his mother. The decision to have her cremated had seemed so simple at the time, practical, even. She had never spoken of an afterlife, never shown any fear of what came after. She had always embraced the inevitable with quiet grace. But now, lying in the silence, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left undone, something his scientific mind had never considered. He closed his eyes, and the visions returned. He was standing in a graveyard, the air thick with an otherworldly fog. The gravestones were worn and ancient, some so old that only fragments of names remained. He heard whispers, soft voices, like the wind through the trees. The souls of the forgotten were calling out to him, their words lost in the fog. He reached out, but the spirits slipped through his fingers, their presence fading as soon as he tried to grasp it. The images shifted, and he saw his mother. But this time, she was different. She wasn't the woman he remembered, frail and sick from the illness that had taken her life. No, this was something else. Something older. She stood before him, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her skin glowed faintly, as if lit from within, and the air around her shimmered with energy. It was as though she was not truly gone, merely waiting for something, waiting for him. Ethan's heart began to pound. He had always believed in the finality of death, that once the body was gone, so too was the soul. But these dreams, these visions suggested something else. He couldn't ignore the possibility that his mother's cremation had disrupted something. Perhaps, in removing the physical body, the final step of her spiritual journey had been altered. The echoes of the past, the souls, the forgotten lives, the boundaries crossed were all connected. And he wondered, with a growing dread, if in seeking to ease her passing, he had somehow, unknowingly, condemned her soul to remain trapped in the space between life and death. The thoughts gnawed at him, relentless and heavy. Were his dreams truly his mind's creations? Or were they fragments of something deeper, something he was only beginning to understand? The air was thick with a palpable energy as Ethan and the group approached the ancient site. Towering stones stood in a circle, worn by centuries of weather and time, their surfaces etched with symbols so old that even the most seasoned archaeologist would struggle to decode their meaning. The location was isolated, hidden deep within a forest that seemed to murmur with secrets, a place untouched by modern civilization. It was a site spoken of only in whispers, known to few, revered by those who had believed it was a threshold, the very edge between the physical world and something much older, much deeper. Ethan had heard the legends. He had read the texts. But now, standing before the stones, there was something undeniably different about the place. The air hummed with an invisible force, and every instinct in him screamed that they were on the cusp of something profound, something that transcended logic. It felt like they were standing at the precipice of a reality that had always been just beyond their grasp. Lena was the first to step forward, her eyes fixed on the center of the stone circle, where a slight indentation in the earth marked the spot. She didn't need to speak. Ethan could feel it too. There was an undeniable connection, a pull that tugged at the very fabric of his being. He glanced at the others, but none of them seemed as affected by the sight as he was. Their expressions a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, but Lena's face was set in quiet determination. "This is it," she whispered, as though the stones themselves could hear her. "The place where the boundary between worlds is thinnest, the veil between life and death, between what is and what could be." Ethan felt his breath catch. The words seemed absurd, even to him, but there was no denying the sensation in the air. The earth beneath his feet seemed to shift subtly, as though it were alive, breathing with the pulse of something ancient. The place felt like a doorway, not just a marker. Without warning, Lena knelt and pressed her hand to the stone at the center of the circle. The ground trembled slightly, sending ripples through the air, and a low hum filled the space. The symbols on the stones began to glow, faint at first, then brighter as the hum grew louder, almost a chant. Ethan's heart raced. He wanted to pull away, but his feet were rooted to the earth, as if something deeper was drawing him in. And then, with a sudden rush of air, the ground beneath them shifted. A low, grinding noise echoed through the stones as the earth split open. A narrow doorway materialized before them, not in the traditional sense, but as if the fabric of reality itself had been torn. A dark passageway stretched before them, leading into a dimly lit expanse beyond the physical world. The scent of the passage was faint but distinct ancient earth, a mix of decay and eternity. It beckoned, offering an unknown path to a realm where the dead might still linger. Ethan's breath faltered as he peered into the opening, the weight of what lay beyond pressing down on him. This wasn't just a portal, it was an invitation. Without a word, they stepped forward. The silence enveloped them as they crossed the threshold, and Ethan felt the world behind him fade away. He couldn't tell where the physical realm ended and the spiritual one began. But he knew, with a shuddering certainty, that they had crossed into a place where the dead were very much alive. The doorway closed behind them with a soft but resolute thud, sealing them into a realm where time seemed to slow. The air was heavy with a sense of history, 1,000 whispers that echoed through the walls of the ancient space. They were in a vast chamber now, its size impossible to fully comprehend. The walls stretched upward, disappearing into shadows, their surfaces covered with markings, lines, shapes, and patterns that seemed to shift with the flickering torchlight. The very architecture of the place suggested it had been constructed not for humans, but for something beyond. At the far end of the chamber, a stone pedestal stood, and atop it, an ancient tome lay open, its pages yellowed with age. The book itself seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, an aura that shimmered faintly in the air. Ethan felt the pull again, stronger this time, a gravitational force that drew him toward the book as if it was meant for his hands alone. Lena moved ahead of him, her steps quiet but determined, her eyes fixed on the tome. "This is it," she murmured. "The truth we've been searching for." The others stood behind her, each absorbed in the monumental presence of the chamber, but none of them spoke. It was as if the very air itself demanded silence, as if the book was a sacred object that should not be disturbed by human noise. Ethan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the fragile pages as if fearing they might crumble under the weight of the moment. But then, something inside him clicked. His skepticism, the rationality that had governed his life until now, slipped away like an old garment. This was more than ancient knowledge. It was the very foundation of everything he had been questioning. He opened the book carefully, and as he did, a sense of revelation washed over him. The words on the page weren't just ancient, they were alive, imbued with meaning that transcended the simple letters on paper. They spoke of the soul's journey, of death as a necessary transformation, and of the resurrection that awaited those who understood the true laws of life and death. The text revealed the history of resurrection in ways Ethan could never have imagined. It described how the ancient civilizations had discovered the secret to resurrection, how the soul could return after death, though only under specific conditions, only when the body was treated with reverence. The burning of the body, the cremation, was not just an end, but a transformation, a final step that allowed the soul to undergo a radical metamorphosis. This was not the kind of resurrection that most religions promised, one of reanimated flesh. It was something deeper, more profound, a return to the essence of life itself. But there was a cost. The text spoke of a dangerous knowledge, one that had been hidden away for centuries, protected by secret societies. It was knowledge that could undo the balance of life and death, that could disrupt the very fabric of existence. The truth of cremation and resurrection had been kept from the world for a reason. Some things, the text warned, were too powerful for humans to wield. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The implications were overwhelming. The knowledge that had eluded him for so long, the key to the question of whether the cremated could rise again, was now clear. And yet, He couldn't shake the feeling that they had uncovered something far darker than they had anticipated. They had opened a door, and there would be no closing it. The hidden truth had been born. Ethan sat motionless, the weight of the ancient text still heavy in his hands. The room around him had grown eerily still, the torchlight flickering as if it, too, were waiting. For the first time, Ethan was unsure of where the boundary between the physical world and the unknown truly lay. The words he had just read seemed to stretch and fold within his mind, challenging his understanding of life and death. He had spent his life searching for evidence, for cold, hard facts, driven by logic and reason. But now, standing on the precipice of something far beyond his comprehension, a new question loomed larger than any he had asked before. Was he willing to let go of everything he had ever believed to understand a deeper truth? Was he ready to embrace the unknown? Lena's voice broke through his thoughts. "Ethan," she said softly, her hand on his shoulder, "you've been asking for answers. The universe is offering them. But you have to choose. You have to be willing to take that first step." The others gathered around him, their faces unreadable, as though they, too, were waiting for Ethan's decision. They had all come this far, but it was clear that the next part of the journey would be different. It would demand something from him, something more than just curiosity or ambition. Ethan closed his eyes, his heart beating faster, and in the silence, he felt it a subtle pull, a sensation that was both outside and inside of him. It was as though the air itself had thickened, as if the very walls of the sacred site were breathing with life. His mind began to unravel, and a sensation of weightlessness overcame him, as though his consciousness was rising from his body, leaving the physical realm behind. A flash of light, distant and ungraspable, enveloped him. The air was cold, and he could sense, more than see, a vast expanse of space stretching in all directions. He was no longer in the temple. He was somewhere else, somewhere beyond. His mind raced, but he felt no fear, only a deep sense of clarity, as if this was where he was always meant to be. Then, figures began to form, souls, or something like them, shapes of light and shadow that drifted through the darkness, passing by with an ethereal grace. They were not like the living, but neither were they fully dead. They existed in that strange place between, their presence gentle but unsettling. In that moment, Ethan understood. The world beyond the living was not a place of finality, but of transition. It was a realm where the soul could travel, evolve, and find its way toward the next step of existence. He saw, for the briefest moment, the cyclical nature of life and death. It was not an end, but a continuation, a process that stretched beyond time itself. The vision faded, and Ethan's body was once again anchored to the earth, his mind still reeling from the experience. He opened his eyes to the room, to the people around him. But something had changed. He had crossed a threshold, and now, more than ever, the truth was no longer something he could deny. The skepticism that had defined him was slipping away, replaced by something deeper, something that pulled him toward the unknown with an undeniable force. He was no longer just seeking answers. He had become part of the truth. The quiet of the night was shattered by an unnatural hum, a vibration in the air that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Ethan stood in the center of the sacred site, his eyes wide, scanning the surroundings as the others gathered close. It was a feeling he had never encountered before, one that carried a strange sense of anticipation and dread, as if something ancient, something long buried, was finally waking. Lena was the first to notice it, her breath catching in her throat as she turned toward the distant shadows. Her brother, once a figure of silence and sorrow in her life, had begun to manifest before them. It was faint at first, a wisp of light, an indistinct figure that flickered like a candle in the wind. Then, With a slow, deliberate movement, the form solidified, taking on the shape of a man, translucent and shimmering with an otherworldly glow. Lena's hand went to her chest, her breath caught in a choked gasp. I thought I'd never see him again," she whispered, the disbelief in her voice unmistakable. Her brother, Daniel, stood before them, his eyes searching, still lost in the same eternal search for connection. The eyes that once held no life now shimmered with the same love that had bound them in life. There were no words, just the unspoken recognition between siblings that only those who had shared a bond of blood could understand. The others around Ethan were silent, watching as Lena stepped forward, her hands trembling, unsure whether to embrace the figure before her or to step back in fear. "Daniel?" she asked, her voice breaking. The figure nodded, though there was no sound, no clear words. The air around him seemed to bend, distorting the reality of the world in a way that left Ethan breathless. The veil between the living and the dead had grown thinner than he ever could have imagined. He had always been skeptical. Science and evidence had guided him, made him question everything. But this was no longer something he could rationalize. This was the return of something that should have been lost forever. Ethan took a step closer, his heart pounding, as he too felt the pull of this strange energy, this inexplicable presence. The souls of the cremated, those who had long been thought beyond return, were not lost, not gone forever. They were simply waiting, their transition not an end but a continuation. And in this moment, Ethan understood. Death was not the finality he had once believed, but a passage, a threshold that was crossed, not once, but repeatedly. Lena's brother reached out, his hand gliding through the air, brushing against her cheek in a gesture of comfort, a silent promise. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, the form began to fade, retreating back into the shadows of the beyond. Ethan watched in silence, his heart heavy with the weight of this revelation. The rejected had returned, not to haunt or to frighten, but to show that death, in all its forms, was not the end. It was a transition, and the truth he had spent his life searching for was now clearer than ever. The air was thick with tension, and the quiet hum of anticipation seemed to vibrate through every corner of the chamber. The ceremony, long spoken of in whispers, was about to begin. Ethan could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the significance of the moment wrapping itself around his chest. The resurrection of the first fully cremated soul was not a mere ritual. It was the culmination of everything they had uncovered, the final test of the knowledge they had spent years chasing. Lena stood at his side, her face pale, a mixture of hope and fear flickering in her eyes. Her brother had been the first to return, but this was something different. This was the soul of a person long gone, their ashes scattered, their very existence thought to be beyond reach. Yet, here they were, preparing to defy the boundaries of life and death itself. She held her breath, every muscle in her body taut with a strange kind of excitement. Ethan's mind raced, torn between the skepticism that had defined his life and the undeniable pull of what he had witnessed. The stories, the ancient texts, the experiences, they all pointed toward this moment, yet he couldn't shake the uncertainty. What if they were wrong? What if this ancient knowledge was something better left untouched? Something that could destroy more than it restored. The group gathered around the central altar, the ritual space illuminated by the soft glow of candles, casting dancing shadows against the stone walls. The sacred symbols, the forgotten sigils, were etched into the floor, surrounding the cremated remains of the first subject, the soul they hoped to bring back. The ashes, neatly preserved, rested in a golden urn, gleaming under the flickering light. The leader of the secret society, his voice a low murmur, began chanting in an ancient tongue. The words reverberated through the room, the sound both foreign and familiar, as if the very language itself had once been spoken by all the ancestors. With each syllable, the air seemed to thicken, and the sense of something vast, something beyond their understanding, pressed against Ethan's consciousness. Lena stepped forward, her face filled with quiet reverence, placing her hands gently on the urn. It was a moment of silence before the chant grew louder, the room pulsating with an energy Ethan could feel in his bones. The urn trembled slightly in Lena's hands, the air heavy with expectation. As the last word of the chant echoed in the chamber, a shift occurred. The space seemed to contract, and for a moment, it felt as though the veil between worlds had been torn open. Ethan's heart raced as the ashes in the urn began to swirl, moving on their own, defying the natural order. Then, in the stillness, something happened, something that would change everything. The ashes began to form a shape, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until a figure appeared before them. It was faint at first, a whisper of a human form, but as the light shifted, the figure solidified, standing tall and whole, just as they had once been in life. The resurrection was no longer a theory. It was real. The room was quiet, save for the soft crackling of the candles and the distant murmurs of those present. Ethan stood motionless, his mind reeling with the realization of what they had just witnessed. The resurrection of the cremated soul was not just a miraculous event, it was a doorway, one that opened both to the past and the future. But with that revelation came a weight he had not expected. Resurrection, it seemed, was not simply a matter of the dead returning. It was deeply tied to the choices of the living, choices that could never be undone once made. Lena, her face still pale from the awe of the moment, looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with a question he could not answer. She was waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to make sense of what they had just seen. But he couldn't. The lines between right and wrong, life and death, were blurred beyond recognition. The leader of the secret society, his face grim, stepped forward and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You must understand," he said softly, as if reading the turmoil that had overtaken Ethan's thoughts. "This power does not belong to us. It is a force older than time itself, and it comes with a price. Resurrection is not just the return of the dead. It is a choice that alters the balance of life and death." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight with fear and uncertainty. The implications of the society's words began to sink in. It wasn't just the act of bringing someone back. It was about what it meant for the world of the living, for the natural order of things. Could they really interfere with that? Could they resurrect those who had been cremated, knowing that it was a decision that could ripple across the very fabric of existence? Lena's voice broke through his thoughts. "Ethan, you've always said that there is no room for belief in things you cannot explain. But what if this is more than we understand? What if we've been wrong about everything?" The question echoed in the silence, and for the first time, Ethan felt the weight of his own skepticism. The world was shifting beneath him, and the walls of logic that had protected him for so long were beginning to crumble. Could he live with the consequences of bringing someone back from the ashes, knowing that it was a decision not just about them but about all of humanity? The resurrection ceremony had shown him the truth that he had spent years searching for, but it also presented him with a choice he had not anticipated. The choice of whether to restore the dead, to defy the natural course of things, was not one he could take lightly. As the figure of the resurrected soul flickered before him, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. The living had power now, power to shape not only their own destinies but the destinies of those who had passed. The question, then, was not whether they could resurrect the dead but whether they should. Ethan's footsteps echoed in the hollow silence as they ventured deeper into the cave, the flickering light of their torches dancing against the jagged stone walls. The air felt heavy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to uncover what had been hidden for millennia. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the weight of their task pressed upon Ethan's chest. They were getting closer. He could feel it, a discovery that might change everything. Lena, walking beside him, whispered something about the legends of an ancient fire, one that burned in the heart of the earth, tied not only to life, but to death itself. Her voice was full of wonder and trepidation, as if she too could sense the significance of what they were about to find. They had followed the clues for days, piecing together fragments of forgotten knowledge, and now, at last, they were on the verge of unveiling the truth. The path grew steeper as they descended, the rocky walls narrowing until they were forced to crouch. Finally, they reached a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in shadows above them. The air was thick, warm, and smelled faintly of sulfur. At the center of the cavern, there was a strange glow, a soft, unearthly light that seemed to pulse and flicker like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The flame was not large, but it radiated a warmth that felt both ancient and deeply familiar, as though it had been waiting for them. Ethan stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the sacred flame. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a fire that neither consumed nor faded, burning with a quiet intensity. The flame didn't seem to burn the air around it, nor did it cast shadows. Instead, it felt as though the flame was made of something more, something beyond physical reality. Lena stepped forward, her hand reaching out instinctively, as if drawn to it by an unseen force. "This is it," she whispered, the awe in her voice undeniable. "The flame that binds the living and the dead." Ethan didn't know what to say. He had always prided himself on his skepticism, on his ability to view the world through the lens of logic and reason. Yet here, in the presence of this ancient fire, those convictions were slipping away, dissolving like smoke. This flame held something far greater than just a physical phenomenon. It held the secret of resurrection itself, the very answer he had been searching for. His heart raced as the realization washed over him. This flame was not just a key to understanding the past, it was a bridge between worlds. The cremated could rise again, not because of any ritual or ceremony, but because the flame burned with the power of life and death itself. It was an elemental force, the very source of resurrection, and it had been hidden for centuries, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered. Ethan approached the flame cautiously, his mind spinning with the enormity of what he was witnessing. He had come so far, yet the questions seemed to multiply. What would happen now? Was he ready to confront the truth, whatever it might be? The answer was somewhere in this flame, and he knew that once it was uncovered, there would be no turning back. The journey to the underworld was not something Ethan had ever imagined himself undertaking. It was not a road marked by physical landmarks or obvious signs. Instead, it was a path that wound its way through the fabric of existence itself, pulling at the edges of his consciousness, unraveling everything he had ever known. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though the very atmosphere were thick with unseen forces, pressing in from all sides. The group traveled in silence, each of them caught in their own thoughts as they followed Lena's guidance. She had walked this path before, or so she claimed, though even she seemed unnerved by the journey ahead. The deeper they descended, the more Ethan began to feel the weight of what they were about to encounter. It wasn't just the physical realm they were entering. It was a place where the very essence of life and death collided. They crossed a threshold, a boundary that blurred the line between the living and the dead, and in that moment, Ethan understood that cremation was not just an act of physical dissolution, but a disruption in the soul's natural journey. He had always believed that death was an end, that the body's return to the earth marked the finality of existence. But here, he realized, was something far more complex, something that defied every logical explanation he had ever clung to. The underworld, as Lena had described, was a place of shifting layers, each one representing a different stage of existence, a different stage of the soul's passage. Some layers were calm, peaceful, where the souls of those who had lived righteous lives rested in quiet reflection. Others were far darker, filled with turbulent energy, as souls wandered aimlessly, caught in a cycle of torment. It was in these darker layers that Ethan understood the true power of cremation. The souls who had been burned, their physical forms reduced to ash, seemed to have lost something essential, a connection to the realm they had once known. As they continued their journey, Ethan felt the profound weight of the souls around them. It was as if the very walls of the underworld were alive with memories, with regrets, and with the essence of those who had crossed over but were yet unfinished, still seeking something that had been lost. Each soul seemed to carry its own story, its own unfinished business. And it was in these stories that Ethan began to grasp the deeper truth. Cremation severed the connection to the body's legacy, to the cycles of life and death that were once so sacred. It was Lena who finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper as they came to a halt. "Do you see it now? The underworld isn't just a place for judgment. It's where souls go to complete their journey or to be lost forever." Ethan's mind raced. Everything he thought he understood about life and death had shifted. The cremated, the souls that had been severed too soon from their physical forms, had to struggle, had to fight to find their way back to the cycles they had disrupted. And now, Ethan realized, the very fate of those souls, his mother among them, hung in the balance. Ethan had long dismissed ghosts as mere fabrications of the living stories designed to explain the unexplainable, the gaps between reality and the unknown. But as he stood in the shadowed recesses of the underworld, surrounded by the quiet, haunting murmurs of souls too restless to find peace, he couldn't deny the undeniable truth unfolding before him. These were not myths, not figments of imagination. They were the trapped souls of the cremated, those who had been torn away from the natural order, their essence dislocated in ways that were neither final nor complete. The ghosts drifted through the ethereal landscape like smoke caught in an eternal wind. Their forms were hazy, indistinct, yet their presence was undeniable. They seemed to hang between worlds, unable to fully cross over to the realm of the dead, unable to return to the living. Some floated aimlessly, lost in their confusion, while others whispered with voices that carried a profound sadness, a plea for recognition, for understanding. Their faces were familiar, yet not quite human. They were faces of the forgotten, of those who had passed through fire and had become something other than what they once were. Ethan approached one of them, a figure standing just beyond his reach. The ghost's eyes locked with his, and for a moment, Ethan felt an overwhelming wave of emotion flood through him. There was a deep, aching loneliness in those eyes, an unspoken awareness of something vital missing. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to speak. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper in the still air. The ghost didn't answer at first. Instead, it tilted its head, as if considering him, before reaching out a translucent hand. It touched his arm, and a sharp, icy sensation rippled through him. "We are not meant to be here," the ghost finally said, its voice soft, like a distant echo. "We were meant to complete our journey, but the fire it burns, not just the body, but the path. The soul is cast adrift, forgotten, lost." Ethan shuddered, the weight of the words sinking deep into his chest. He had always believed that death, in any form, was a finality. But this was something far more complicated, far more painful than he could have ever imagined. The ghosts that surrounded him were not just remnants of the past. They were the living's ignorance made manifest. The world had failed to recognize the sanctity of the body's transformation into death. And in that failure, they had created a new form of suffering souls caught between the veil, unable to fully transcend the physical realm. "We are not gone," the ghost continued, its voice a fragile thread that hung in the air. We are the echoes of what should have been, and we wait for understanding, for redemption. Ethan looked around at the other souls, all of them yearning for something they couldn't name. The world had denied them the peace of transition, and now they lingered, forever in limbo. In that moment, Ethan understood something he had never been able to grasp before. The power of the soul was not bound to the body, but it needed the body's completion to transcend fully. The cremated souls, having been severed too soon, wandered, searching for the wholeness they had lost, and he realized, with a shudder, that his mother's soul was among them. Ethan felt a heavy silence descend over him as the weight of the truth pressed down on his chest. The ghost's words echoed in his mind the price of knowledge. He had thought that uncovering the hidden truth would bring him clarity, a resolution to the questions that had haunted him since his mother's death. But now, standing in the twilight between life and death, he realized that the cost of this knowledge was not just something abstract, a price in terms of wisdom or understanding. It was something far more personal. As the group gathered around the dim, flickering flame that had guided them to this place, the ancient text they had discovered whispered its warnings to Ethan. The words, once cryptic, were now painfully clear. They had unearthed knowledge that should have remained buried, hidden for centuries, not just from the living, but from those who had died. The secrets they had unlocked, the laws of the soul, the sacred flame, the resurrection ceremony were not meant to be known. Those who sought the truth, who dug too deeply, risked being caught between the realms, forever lingering in a state of neither life nor death. Who had shared so many of her spiritual insights with Ethan, looked at him with a mixture of pity and understanding. She had seen the dangers of such knowledge firsthand. She knew that the more one uncovered about the soul, the more one became entangled in its complexities. The truth could offer liberation, yes, but it could also imprison you in a way you could never escape. "The veil is thin here," she said softly, her voice trembling with a quiet foreboding. "You must decide whether the price is worth it. Once you know, really know, you can't turn back. The souls you've encountered, the ghosts you've seen, they are not just lost wanderers. They are warnings, Ethan. Warnings about what happens when you overstep the natural boundaries between the living and the dead." Ethan's mind raced as he processed her words. He had been so consumed with finding answers, so focused on understanding the nature of death and resurrection, that he hadn't stopped to consider the true cost of his pursuit. The ghosts, the revelations about the sacred flame, the ceremonies that could bring souls back. He had been seeking to transcend the limits of life, but in doing so, he had risked crossing a threshold that would forever alter his existence. The idea of being stuck between the worlds, forever haunted by the spirits he had sought to understand, was a nightmare he could not escape. And yet, there was a part of him, perhaps the same part that had driven him to pursue the truth in the first place, that was unwilling to turn away now. The need to know, to understand, was stronger than the fear of what might come. With a heavy heart, he looked at his companions. He had already crossed a line, and there was no going back. But now, as the fog of realization lifted, he understood the price of the knowledge he sought, and it was far greater than he had ever imagined. As the revelations about resurrection began to spread beyond their small circle, a rising tension shadowed every conversation. What had once seemed like an abstract philosophical pursuit had now become a threat, a challenge to the very fabric of existence as they knew it. The idea that souls, especially those who had been cremated, could return, reshaping the natural order, ignited fierce opposition. Roland, a respected scientist and a man of reason, emerged as the leader of this resistance. His disbelief was not just academic, it was personal. To him, the very thought of resurrection was a dangerous fantasy, a reckless attempt to subvert the processes that governed life and death. Roland's voice, once calm and measured, had become sharper in the weeks since the first resurrection ceremony. His meetings with Ethan and the group had grown tense, filled with sharp rebuttals and challenging questions. He spoke of the sanctity of the natural cycle, the unchanging truth that death was not something to be undone, but embraced as part of the eternal flow of life. He warned that meddling with it would unravel the very essence of what it meant to be human. "We are not gods," Roland would argue, pacing the room, his eyes bright with the urgency of his conviction. To tamper with death, to bring back the cremated, the lost, is to usurp the role of the divine. We are stepping into realms we were never meant to understand. And when we do, there will be no undoing it. There will be chaos, untold suffering. No one can bear the burden of reversing death, of pulling souls back from the void. Ethan, caught between the pull of Roland's rationality and the haunting truths they had uncovered, found himself questioning the very foundation of his beliefs. Could they really be wrong? Could resurrection, the return of souls, truly disrupt the natural order? Was it worth risking everything for the knowledge they had sought? Roland's group, a mix of scientists, theologians, and former skeptics, had begun to gather, spreading the message of caution to those willing to listen. They rallied behind the idea that what Ethan and his companions were doing was not only unnatural, but dangerous. They feared that the act of resurrection would tear apart the delicate balance between the living and the dead, creating a rift that would be impossible to mend. In secret meetings, Roland spoke with his followers about the spiritual dangers of resurrecting souls. "The souls we are dealing with were meant to rest," he said, his voice heavy with a sense of impending doom. "We cannot stand in the way of what nature has decided. To do so would be to invite chaos, to risk the very stability of the universe." Despite the mounting resistance, Ethan could not shake the conviction that there was more to the story, something far beyond the fears of Roland and his group. As the tension between the two sides deepened, he found himself at a crossroads. The stakes had never been higher, and the path forward seemed more uncertain with each passing day. Could the power of resurrection truly be a force for healing, or was it a deadly force that would undo the world as they knew it? As Ethan delved deeper into the origins of the cremation ritual, he began to unravel secrets that challenged everything he thought he knew about death. The ancient texts, hidden away in libraries and scrolls long neglected, provided cryptic accounts of the cremation process. What had once seemed like a simple method of disposal had, in these ancient texts, been transformed into something far more significant, a key moment in the soul's journey. Ethan pored over the details of the ritual, cross-referencing accounts from civilizations that practiced cremation for thousands of years. He discovered that the act of fire, in many ancient cultures, was not simply an end but a transformation, a passage. The flames, it seemed, were believed to both free and bind the soul. Some texts hinted that the soul was released from its earthly prison during the cremation, its journey into the afterlife made easier. Yet others suggested that the very process could trap the soul, preventing it from moving on, or even causing it to wander in eternal unrest. The deeper he probed, the more confused he became. Was cremation a means of liberation, or was it a force of imprisonment? Some traditions spoke of the fire as purifying the body, stripping away its material remnants and allowing the soul to ascend in a purified state. But others warned that burning the body before the proper rites were performed left the soul unmoored, its energy scattered and unable to find peace. Ethan began to consider the implications for his mother. Had her choice of cremation caused her soul to be trapped in the limbo between worlds? Or had it freed her, allowing her to transcend the limitations of her earthly body? He couldn't stop himself from questioning if the very ritual he had witnessed with his own eyes, the fire that consumed her, had altered her spiritual path forever. As he walked through the ruins of ancient temples and burial sites, he contemplated the nature of the soul's attachment to the body. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that death was not as straightforward as he had once believed. It wasn't merely the end of life, but a profound process, one that involved both the physical and spiritual realms, sometimes in ways that defied logic. There were whispers in the text that the soul was not always ready to move on after death. The body, in these interpretations, held on to the spirit, making the transition to the afterlife more complicated. For the cremated, this bond was severed in a violent way. But could this severance bring peace, or was it a tear too deep, one that couldn't be mended? These questions gnawed at him as he stared into the flames of a fire that burned just a little too brightly, as if calling to him from some distant corner of the universe. The secrets of cremation were becoming clearer. But with clarity came new fears, fears that he might never truly understand what had happened to his mother's soul, or to any of those who had been sent to the flames. As the group continued their journey, Ethan found himself drawn to an ancient teaching that seemed to defy the conventional understanding of life and death. It was a concept buried deep within the forgotten pages of spiritual texts, a duality of existence that connected life's end to a new form of transcendence. What if death was not a finality, but merely a passage? What if the dissolution of the body, particularly through cremation, was not an end, but a transformative process? The more they uncovered, the clearer the picture became. According to the texts, life was a cycle, one of spiritual growth, and death was merely the next phase, a pathway to transcendence. The dissolution of the body through fire was said to be a pivotal moment in that cycle. Rather than being a violent termination, cremation was described as a necessary process, one that facilitated the soul's journey beyond the material world. It was a concept that felt both liberating and unsettling. Ethan had always viewed life as finite, an unbroken string leading to a definitive end. Death was something to be feared, a shadow over every moment of living. But here, in the ancient wisdom that seemed to reach across millennia, death was merely a veil, a barrier to be passed through before the soul could attain its next stage of existence. Cremation, in this context, was not a desecration of the body but a sacred ritual, helping the soul to shed the remnants of its earthly attachment and step into a higher plane of being. The more Ethan pondered the idea, the more his perspective shifted. Perhaps cremation didn't trap the soul, as he had feared, but rather freed it from the weight of physical existence. Perhaps the fire was a purifier, burning away the ties that bound the soul to a world that no longer served it, allowing it to rise into something greater, something more complete. The group discussed these ideas with increasing urgency, each person's own beliefs shifting in the face of the knowledge they were uncovering. They were no longer speaking of death as an end, but as a necessary passage, a part of the grand cycle of existence that moved beyond time and space. The body's dissolution through cremation might appear as destruction, but in truth, it was a form of rebirth, a moment of clarity, where the soul was allowed to transcend its earthly bonds and ascend to a higher spiritual plane. Ethan's mind raced with these new revelations, a whirl of conflicting thoughts. The fire, which had once seemed so final, now seemed to hold the key to a deeper understanding of the universe's mysteries. It was a paradox, a duality. The body was consumed, but the soul was reborn. Life and death were not opposites. They were parts of the same cosmic rhythm, two sides of the same coin, each incomplete without the other. And in that realization, Ethan began to understand that perhaps the cremated could rise again not as they once were, but as something entirely new. The day of reckoning arrived as the sun sank low in the sky, casting long shadows over a world teetering on the edge of transformation. Ethan stood at the precipice, his mind racing as he grappled with the profound implications of everything he had uncovered. The knowledge they had uncovered of the soul's transcendence, of cremation as a gateway, of the resurrection that could follow, had spread far beyond their small group. What was once a personal quest for truth had now become a global dilemma. Across the world, people were coming to terms with the possibility that life and death were not as they had believed. Scientists, theologians, spiritual leaders, and everyday citizens alike now faced the ultimate question. Would they embrace the possibility of resurrection, the idea that the cremated could rise again, or would they reject it, clinging to their old notions of finality and the natural order? Ethan could feel the weight of the world bearing down on him, the collective uncertainty pressing into the air. Across the globe, the conversation had grown heated. Governments, religious organizations, and scientific bodies had called for a day of reckoning, a moment where the people, the masses, would choose whether to accept or deny the knowledge that had been uncovered. Would they open themselves to the potential of life beyond death, or would they choose to preserve the old understanding, rejecting the possibility of spiritual transformation through the resurrection of the cremated? Ethan's journey had brought him to this moment, a moment that transcended his own personal questions. This was no longer about his mother or the pain of her loss. It was about something far bigger, something that spoke to the very nature of existence itself. The resurrection wasn't just an abstract concept, it was a real, tangible possibility that could change the world forever. As the reckoning approached, there were no easy answers. The idea of resurrection threatened the foundations of everything the world had held dear. It challenged long-held beliefs about the finality of death, the sanctity of the body, and the natural order that had governed life for eons. Would humanity, so steeped in its own understanding of existence, be ready for such a profound change? In the hours leading up to the reckoning, Ethan found himself lost in reflection. He had lived his life as a skeptic, rejecting the idea of anything beyond the physical realm. Yet now, with the weight of the evidence before him, he could not deny that something profound was unfolding. He could feel it in the air, in the conversations taking place, in the collective heartbeat of humanity. The question of whether the cremated would rise again was no longer just a philosophical debate. It was a matter of spiritual survival, of embracing the unknown and choosing to step beyond the veil of death. The world, it seemed, stood divided, but the reckoning was inevitable. Whether they chose to embrace resurrection or cling to the cycle of life and death, the answer would shape the course of history, and it would reveal the truth that had been hidden for so long. The air was thick with tension as Ethan and the group stood before the entrance of the sacred temple, a place that had been untouched by time. It loomed before them, its ancient stones worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Today, it would serve as the backdrop for their trial, a test of their resolve and their willingness to confront the truth about life and death. Ethan's heart beat heavily in his chest as they approached the stone steps. Knowing this would be no ordinary challenge, the trial would not only test their intellect and physical endurance, but also their very souls. The weight of the question that had consumed them, whether the cremated could rise again, had led them here, to this final reckoning. It was time to prove, once and for all, that they had the courage to face what they had learned. The temple, sacred and untouched by human hands for so long, seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. Ethan felt a strange pull toward it, like an invisible force guiding him forward, urging him to step closer to the edge of an abyss he could not see. The others felt it too, the invisible threads that bound them to the very heart of the question they had been chasing for so long. The truth, it seemed, would demand a price. They were led into a dimly lit chamber, the air thick with incense and the scent of ancient wood. At its center, a stone altar stood, its surface etched with symbols that Ethan had seen before in the texts they had uncovered. This was where the sacred trial would unfold, a trial that demanded not only their physical strength but their spiritual conviction. The first challenge was simple. They had to carry a heavy stone, one that symbolized the burden of human mortality. The weight of the stone was nearly unbearable, but as they lifted it, they realized it was not just a test of physical strength. It was a test of their ability to endure, to confront the weight of death itself. The second challenge was more abstract, a labyrinth of mirrors. Each reflection showed a different version of themselves, twisted and distorted. They had to navigate the maze, confronting their deepest fears and insecurities. Ethan saw himself as a skeptic, a man unwilling to embrace what lay beyond the material world. In another mirror, he saw his mother, cremated and reduced to ash, her spirit waiting to transcend. The vision shook him, and he almost turned back. But the question burned within him. Could he truly deny the truth of the resurrection? Finally, the last challenge was spiritual. Ethan had to face the presence of the dead, the spirits who had transcended their earthly bodies. The air grew thick with the weight of their presence, and he could feel their eyes upon him. It was as if the spirits of the cremated were watching, waiting to see if he, too, could cross the threshold between life and death. As Ethan stood there, the realization dawned on him. This was not just a trial, it was a decision to embrace the unknown, to accept the possibility of life beyond death. With every step, every test, he could feel himself letting go of his old beliefs, his skepticism, and moving toward a new understanding of what it meant to truly live and to die. As the trial came to its climax, Ethan felt his body tremble, not from physical exhaustion, but from an overwhelming sense of revelation. The stone altar, the mirrors, the spirits they had all led him here. To this singular moment, the weight of everything they had uncovered, all the ancient texts, the mystical symbols, the truths hidden for centuries, now swirled together in his mind like a vortex he couldn't escape. In the midst of the chamber, the air seemed to shift, as if the very fabric of reality was warping around him. He stood frozen, caught between the past and the present, the known and the unknown. The spirits that had surrounded them felt closer now, their presence almost tangible, as if they were waiting for him to understand something that had eluded him until now. His eyes fell on the stone altar once more. The weight of life, death, and resurrection was not a cycle as he had once believed. It was a dance, a delicate interplay of interconnected forces that transcended the physical world. The cremation, the burial, the ashes, all were part of a larger pattern, one that flowed from the earth to the heavens and back again. For the first time, Ethan realized that resurrection wasn't a singular event that happened at the end of life. It wasn't just about bringing the dead back to life, it was about the constant transformation of the soul, the eternal unfolding of existence itself. The body, whether cremated or buried, was not the final destination for the soul. It was simply a passage, a necessary step in the grand journey of existence. And death, as he had once understood it, wasn't an end, but the beginning of something greater, a movement toward a higher plane of being. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. Life and death weren't opposites, they were one, inseparable. What came after death wasn't a void, but a realm of infinite possibility. The body might dissolve, the ashes might scatter, but the soul, the essence of what made them who they were, was immortal, and its journey was not confined to the physical plane. As he stood there, the shadows around him seemed to retreat, and the figure of Lena, her eyes filled with an unspoken understanding, stepped forward. She was not alone. Behind her, the spirit of her brother, whom they had believed lost to the world forever, appeared in a soft glow of light. He was no longer a mere memory or a fleeting presence. He was real, tangible, standing in front of them. Lena's brother had been the first to rise, to prove that death could be transcended, and that the cremated could return. And in that moment, Ethan understood. This was the turning point. Their quest was no longer about seeking knowledge, it was about accepting a new truth. one that had always been there, hidden in the very fabric of the universe. The resurrection was not a singular event. It was a living, breathing part of existence itself. The world seemed to hold its breath. The future, uncertain and unknowable, now stretched before him. And for the first time, Ethan felt that he was ready to step into it. The room was still, save for the soft hum of energy in the air as the first soul was resurrected. Ethan watched, breath held, as the figure before him slowly took shape, the outlines of a body forming in the faint glow of the sacred light. It was a delicate process, one they had spent years preparing for, one that felt as if the world itself held its breath. This was the moment, the first resurrection, the moment when everything they had uncovered, everything they had believed, would finally become real. The figure shimmered, flickering in and out of focus. Then, it solidified. At first, it was an indistinct form, a blur of light and shadow. But slowly, the contours became clearer, and Ethan could make out the face. It was a woman he did not recognize but whose eyes reflected something familiar, a sense of ancient sorrow and wisdom. The woman stood there for a moment, silent, as though she were trying to grasp her surroundings. Her gaze drifted from one person to another, but there was no recognition in her eyes. Ethan's heart beat faster as he realized that while she had returned, she had not returned whole. The process of resurrection was not without its cost, and he could feel the tension in the room rise as the soul struggled to find its place once more in the physical world. The woman's hands trembled slightly, reaching out as if trying to touch the air itself, but she seemed unsure, hesitant. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, as if still finding its way back into existence. "Where am I?" she asked, her words laced with confusion. Ethan's throat tightened. He had expected the soul to be disoriented, to feel the weight of returning. But he had not expected the profound sense of displacement that hung in the air. This was more than just a resurrection. It was a collision of worlds. The soul retained the memories of its previous life. He could see it in her eyes, but it was clear that the bridge between the living and the dead was not so easily crossed. She looked at Lena, then at Ethan, as if searching for answers, but there was something lost in her gaze. "I remember," she whispered, "but I don't belong here." The group exchanged glances, uncertainty clouding their faces. They had anticipated difficulty, but the deep sense of alienation this soul experienced was beyond anything they had expected. The woman's memories were intact, yes, but they were fragmented, scattered like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. Her connection to the world of the living was tenuous, fragile. Ethan stepped forward cautiously, reaching out as if to offer reassurance. But as his hand approached, the woman recoiled, her expression pained. It was as if the very act of returning had left her broken in ways that were impossible to heal. "Can you remember what you were before?" Ethan asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman blinked, her brow furrowed as she tried to gather her thoughts. "I remember the life I had," she murmured. "But I feel disconnected, as if I am only half of who I once was." The room fell into a heavy silence. They had succeeded in resurrecting her, yes, but it was clear that this first soul, though returned, was not yet whole. The journey to reintegrate into the living world would not be as simple as they had imagined. The revelation was more profound than any of them could have anticipated. Ethan stood in the center of the chamber, the weight of everything they had learned pressing down on him. The woman who had been resurrected was now seated in the midst of the group, her disoriented expression slowly giving way to clarity as she began to speak of her journey through death. Her words were fragmented, but they painted a picture of a world beyond their understanding, a realm where time twisted and space folded in ways they could not fully comprehend. As her voice grew steadier, The truth began to crystallize in Ethan's mind. The resurrection they had witnessed was not a return to life in its simplest form. It was a transition, one that required more than just the restoration of the body. It was, as the sacred texts had hinted, a process of spiritual purification. Those who had been cremated, whose physical forms had been returned to the earth, did not simply rise again. They had to be cleansed, to go through a purification that bridged the gap between their past lives and the new existence they were meant to embrace. Ethan's thoughts whirled as he processed this. The cremation of the body, once seen as an irreversible finality, was not an end but a beginning. The soul, once freed from its earthly form, was granted the chance to renew itself, to shed the burdens it had carried in life. The process was slow, painstaking. It was not a mere return but a rebirth, a chance to cleanse the residual attachments, regrets, and desires that might have bound the soul to the mortal realm. But as the group absorbed this truth, there was no denying the fear that followed. It wasn't just the possibility of resurrection that unsettled them, it was the cost. The souls of the cremated could rise again, but only if they were willing to endure the rigorous process of spiritual renewal. And for those who had lost loved ones, the implications were chilling. Could they bear the thought that their loved ones might not return in the form they once knew them? Would the souls of the departed, after enduring such a transformation, still be the same? The woman, still struggling to reintegrate into the world of the living, had become a living embodiment of this truth. She was not merely a shadow of the person she had been. She was something new, something different, shaped by the very process of resurrection and renewal. Ethan could see it in her eyes now, the weight of what she had experienced in the afterlife. She was no longer the person who had once walked the earth. She was something more, but also less. For a moment, there was silence. The enormity of the truth settled over them, leaving a heavy, bittersweet taste in their mouths. Resurrection was no longer an abstract concept, it was a truth fraught with complexities, offering both hope and fear. Ethan knew that this knowledge, the knowledge they had uncovered, would not only change their lives, but the entire world. The cremated could rise again, but the price was far greater than they had ever imagined. The world had never felt so divided. What had begun as a quiet whisper of resurrection now echoed through the streets and the minds of the living, carrying with it an undercurrent of fear and unrest. The line between the realms of the living and the dead had blurred, and with it came the rise of an unimaginable conflict, one that none could have predicted. Souls, once at peace in their final resting places, now fought to return to the world of the living, desperate to reclaim what they had lost. Ethan had witnessed the first soul's return with awe, but now he felt only dread. The process of resurrection, once thought to be a pure gift, had become a battleground for dominance. Those who had passed, whose bodies had been reduced to ash, had discovered that their existence was not as easily erased as they had once believed. They were reaching out, pulling at the fabric of the living world, demanding the right to return. Some came with peaceful intentions, hoping only to reunite with their families, to finish their unfinished business. Others, however, came with a hunger for more, a hunger that had no place in the physical world. At first, the living were hesitant. Some welcomed the idea of their loved ones returning, seeing it as a miracle, a chance for closure, or a second chance. But as the number of souls returning grew, so did the tension. It wasn't long before resistance began to form. People feared the presence of the dead. They feared what might come with them, spirits that did not belong in the world of the living, who carried with them the residue of the afterlife, the baggage of unfinished fates. In every corner of the earth, battles raged between the living and the spirits, each side unwilling to give in. Ethan found himself at the heart of this struggle, torn between his understanding of the resurrection process and the undeniable terror it stirred in the hearts of those around him. He had seen the dead return, had felt their yearning, but he had also witnessed the turmoil they caused. The world was not ready for the presence of the dead, not in the way the spirits had hoped. The living were not prepared to share their world, and the dead were not prepared to coexist without consequence. In every city, the question grew more urgent. What would happen if the dead were allowed to return? Could humanity survive such an upheaval? Could the living coexist with those who had passed on, knowing that they carried with them the power to reshape the very world they had left behind? Ethan's heart ached as he watched the war of souls unfold before him, knowing that the answers they sought were no longer just theoretical. They were now a matter of survival, of balance, of what it meant to truly live and die. The world had changed, irrevocably, and Ethan could feel the weight of that change pressing down on him, on everyone. What had once seemed like a distant, philosophical question whether the cremated could rise again had transformed into a tangible, inescapable reality. The very fabric of existence had been torn open, and the boundary between life and death had dissolved, leaving an unsettling space in its place. The dead walked among the living, not as shadows or phantoms, but as beings with flesh and spirit intertwined, struggling to reintegrate into the world they had once known. In the cities, the streets had become divided. The living clung to the familiar, to what they had always known: jobs, routines, the fragile safety of a life untouched by death. They feared what the return of the dead meant for their future, their place in a world that now seemed no more permanent than the grave itself. Yet, there were others who welcomed the return of the spirits, who found solace in being able to once again touch their loved ones, to hold them, even if just for a moment. But this new world was not without its tension. It was one of impossible choices. The living were left to decide whether to continue their lives as if nothing had changed, or to adapt to this strange new reality, one where death no longer held dominion. Ethan walked through the crowds, his mind racing. He had always approached the world with logic, with reason. Yet here, in this new age, none of that mattered. The logic of science, the rules he had trusted, could no longer explain what he was witnessing. Souls, once bound to their physical forms and buried beneath the earth, now stood before him, living once more. Some still bore the marks of their deaths, their bodies not fully restored, while others seemed whole again, as if time had never touched them. But it wasn't just the souls that had returned. The very nature of reality had shifted. The laws that governed life, death, and rebirth were no longer clear-cut. The air felt different, charged with something ancient and profound, as though the universe itself had become more malleable, more fluid. There were no longer any certainties, only choices. Would the living accept the return of the dead, or would they resist it, desperate to reclaim the old world they knew? Ethan found himself standing at the crossroads of this new world. He had once asked the question whether the cremated could rise again, but now he realized the question had grown beyond him. It was no longer just about resurrection. It was about understanding how life could continue when death no longer held the same power over it. What did it mean to live in a world where the rules had been upended? Ethan knew the answer would not be easy, and perhaps it would never fully come. But one thing was certain: he had no choice but to navigate this new reality, to find his place in a world that no longer made sense. The world was in flux, the old ways crumbling under the weight of a new reality. The living and the dead, once separate and distinct, now shared the same world, bound by an unspoken agreement to coexist. The lines that had separated them were fading, and humanity, as it had known itself, was being reshaped. The resurrection was no longer a distant possibility, but an ongoing transformation, unfolding with each passing day. The dead had returned, but their place in this new world was still unclear. Some embraced it, their souls eager to reconnect with the lives they had left behind. Others found the transition harder, trapped between two worlds, unable to fully reintegrate into either. Ethan, once a skeptic, now found himself standing at the precipice of this strange new age. He had seen the dead rise, seen their struggles, their yearning to return to something familiar. He had witnessed the joy in the eyes of those who were reunited with loved ones, and the sorrow in those who found themselves caught between worlds, not knowing where they belonged. It was clear to him now that the process of resurrection was not a simple return. It was a rebirth, a reordering of creation itself. The world, as Ethan knew it, was beginning its own process of renewal. The soil that had been scorched by the fires of death was now being watered by the tears of both the living and the dead. The cities were becoming places of exchange, where the living and the dead met, not as strangers, but as part of a shared experience. The dead brought with them knowledge, memories of a time long past, and with that knowledge came a responsibility to help guide the living toward understanding. The living, in turn, offered the dead a glimpse of what had changed, what had been lost, and what could still be gained in this new world. In this time of transition, Ethan had become a key figure, not because he had the answers, but because he was willing to ask the questions. He understood now that the process of resurrection was not just about the return of souls. It was about the rebirth of creation itself. This was not a simple continuation of life as it had been. It was an evolution, a merging of two worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable. With each day that passed, Ethan saw the world slowly beginning to heal. The dead, though still grappling with their place in this new reality, found a sense of purpose. They had come back, not to reclaim what had been lost, but to help guide the living toward something greater. And the living, with all their doubts and fears, began to understand that the world they had known was no longer the same. They, too, were part of this rebirth, and together they would have to learn how to live in this new creation. Ethan stood in the midst of it all, watching the slow, steady transformation unfold. The rebirth of creation had begun, and he had a part to play in it. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he understood that it wasn't the end that mattered. It was the journey, the process of creation and recreation that was truly important. The first whispers of immortality were intoxicating. The dead, who had returned, were granted the unimaginable eternity in the form of resurrection. It was a promise of life beyond death, a chance to reclaim what was lost. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that immortality was not the gift it had once seemed. Ethan watched as some of those who had been resurrected began to show signs of weariness, not in their bodies but in their minds. At first, it had been easy to see the return of the dead as a miracle reunion with loved ones, the chance to continue the unfinished stories of their lives. But as time passed, the bright spark of excitement began to dull, replaced by something darker, something intangible. The resurrection was not without its cost. Some of those who had returned could no longer find purpose. The eternal, it seemed, had its own weight. A woman, once full of life, now moved through the world with a haunted expression. She had been a mother, a wife, but the faces of her family no longer sparked recognition. They were strangers now, no longer the ones she remembered, but echoes of a past she could no longer connect with. Her eyes, once vibrant, were now dimmed, and her voice carried the weariness of someone who had lived not just a life, but many. Eternity, she realized too late, was not a gift. It was a prison. Ethan felt the weight of it too. As he witnessed the consequences of resurrection, he began to wonder, if the dead were truly meant to return, should they be bound to the same world they had left behind? Was it truly a blessing to be forced to continue in a world that had moved on without them? The living, too, were beginning to feel the strain. Some had embraced the dead, but others, faced with their own mortality, started to resent the immortality the resurrected had gained. The very presence of the dead was a reminder that time, once a precious thing, no longer held any real meaning. Without death, life itself began to lose its value. The dead walked the earth, but they did not live. They moved like shadows of their former selves, trapped in a cycle of endless existence that no one had ever asked for. And those who sought immortality began to see it for what it truly was, a hollow eternity. A life that would stretch on, but never with the meaning it once had. Ethan knew the truth now. Immortality, like resurrection, came at a cost, one that no one could escape. There was no simple return to life, only an endless continuation of the same struggles, the same fears, the same losses. Immortality was a price that no soul, living or dead, could truly afford. As the first waves of resurrected souls settled into the new reality, the world braced for what was to come. The process of resurrection had been both a blessing and a curse. And while many were grateful for the second chance at life, there were those whose return had been delayed souls once rejected, kept from the afterlife by the sacred trials they had failed, now stirred from their restless slumber. Their return was not a peaceful one. It began with whispers, rumors of strange figures walking the earth, individuals whose faces no one recognized, their eyes filled with an unsettling emptiness. These were the souls who had been deemed unworthy, souls whose actions in their past lives had left a mark of sin too deep to be cleansed by the process of resurrection. They had been rejected, sent to the shadowy plains where their memories were lost to time. But now, as the veil between the living and the dead grew thin, they had returned, and with them came chaos. Ethan had always been a skeptic, but even he couldn't ignore the dark energy that clung to these souls. They were not like the others, those who had been welcomed back into the fold. The rejected souls bore an aura of anger, of confusion, and of something darker. They were not at peace, and their very presence seemed to disrupt the delicate balance between life and death. It was Lena who first noticed the shift. "They're not like the others," she whispered one evening, watching as the rejected souls passed by, their hollow eyes never meeting anyone's gaze. "They don't belong here." Ethan nodded, but the unease in his chest was palpable. He had felt it too. These souls had been turned away once, and now they had returned, not with gratitude, but with bitterness. They had been given a second chance without having earned it, and the world around them was beginning to unravel because of it. The moral dilemma gnawed at him. Should they have been allowed to return? He had seen firsthand the suffering that resurrection could bring, but at least those souls had come back with the hope of redemption. These rejected souls, however, carried only the weight of their past transgressions, and their presence threatened to rip apart the fragile peace they had fought so hard to build. There was no easy answer. The question of whether to allow these souls to remain in the world was something Ethan could not ignore. The process of resurrection had always been meant to offer the dead a chance at redemption. But what about those who had been deemed unworthy? Could they be allowed to live again? And if not, what was their fate? Ethan found himself at a crossroads, torn between compassion and the harsh reality that some souls were better left to rest. He could feel the weight of his decision, knowing that whichever path he chose, it would change the world forever. The return of the rejected souls had set the stage for the next battle, a battle not just between life and death, but between redemption and damnation. The discovery of the Temple of Resurgence was not one they had expected. After the chaos of the rejected soul's return, Ethan and his companions had believed the world was on the brink of collapse. The balance between life and death was in turmoil, and every decision seemed to lead to a deeper fracture in the fabric of existence. But as the unrest spread, a whispered legend resurfaced of a place where the resurrection of souls could be controlled. a temple that held the key to ensuring the process was not only safe but just. The journey to find the temple was not easy. They traveled through forgotten lands, where the earth seemed to hold its breath, where time itself felt suspended in the air. Each step led them deeper into ancient territory, hidden from the eyes of the modern world. The temple, they were told, lay beneath the roots of an ancient forest, a place untouched by human hands for centuries. Its location was veiled in mystery, obscured by layers of forgotten history. Some said the temple was never meant to be found. Others believed it would reveal itself only to those who had earned the right to understand the true nature of resurrection. Ethan had been skeptical at first. It was hard for him to believe that such a temple could still exist after all this time. But the clues they had uncovered in ancient texts pointed them in this direction. The energy surrounding it, though, was undeniable. The closer they got, the more Ethan could feel the pull of something greater, something ancient and powerful. The forest seemed alive with whispers, its shadows stretching long into the darkness, guiding them, testing them. When they finally arrived, the sight was overwhelming. The temple was not like any structure Ethan had ever seen. Its walls were covered in strange, shifting symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air was thick with a sense of quiet reverence, as if the very space held memories of countless souls. In the center of the temple stood a massive stone altar, ancient yet pristine, surrounded by pillars that seemed to reach for the heavens. It was clear that this was no ordinary place. It was a sanctuary of sorts, a threshold between worlds, designed to harness the power of resurrection. They stepped inside, their movements tentative, as if entering a realm where the laws of existence could be bent, where life and death were not opposing forces, but two sides of the same coin. The temple's secrets were not meant to be discovered lightly. Ethan could sense the danger in its walls, the weight of the knowledge it held, but he also understood that this was the key to the next phase of their journey, the key to understanding how resurrection could truly work, not just as a promise, but as a responsibility. As they explored deeper into the temple, the first of the truths began to reveal themselves. But not without challenge. What they would uncover here would force them to question everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the fragile line between them. As the resurrection process became more widespread, not all souls returned as they were meant to. Ethan had seen the miracles, people returning from the ashes, families reunited, joy flooding the world as loved ones stepped once more into the living realm. But as the days passed, the cracks began to show. The lines between life and death were never meant to be blurred so recklessly. Ethan had always believed in the sanctity of natural order, yet even he couldn't deny that something had changed. But now, standing in the temple surrounded by those who had returned, he witnessed the true cost of the resurrection. It began with whispers. Souls that had come back, that had been granted a second chance at life, began to fade. At first, it was subtle, small signs, like a lost memory, a momentary lapse in personality, or the coldness that seemed to settle into their eyes. The living, unaware of the darkness creeping back into these beings, celebrated their return. But as the days dragged on, the truth began to unravel. One soul in particular, a woman named Miriam, who had returned to be with her family, was the first to fall back into the darkness. At first, no one noticed. She walked through the days, smiling with her children, speaking the same words she had spoken before her death. But Ethan saw it, the flicker of something in her eyes, the shadow that followed her wherever she went. It was as if the light had been sucked out of her, replaced with an insatiable hunger that nothing could satisfy. Miriam's transformation was slow, like the creeping tendrils of an illness no one wanted to acknowledge. It was clear that her soul, though restored to the physical plane, had not been restored to its original purity. She began to withdraw from her family, hiding in the corners of their home, whispering things no one understood. And then, one night, she disappeared entirely. Ethan followed the trail. When he found her, she was standing in the middle of a field, staring into the horizon, her face twisted in a grimace of pain. Her body was still there, but it was not her anymore. The soul that had returned had been tainted by the darkness of the underworld, the forces it had encountered beyond the veil, and now it was pulling her back into its depths. He watched as Miriam's form began to dissolve, the resurrection unraveling before his eyes. It was as if the world was rejecting her once again, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Her scream echoed through the night, not in pain, but in grief. Grief for the life she would never truly reclaim. The resurrection process, it seemed, had a cost Ethan had not been prepared to face. Not all souls, it turned out, were meant to return. Some carried within them the shadows of their past lives, the weight of their actions, the darkness that death had failed to purge. These souls were doomed to fade back into the abyss, never to find peace. And in that moment, Ethan understood. Resurrection wasn't just about bringing the dead back. It was about ensuring they were ready to return. Some souls were meant to rest, and forcing them to return only opened the door for tragic consequences. The world had become an endless loop, life, death, and rebirth repeating with an unsettling rhythm that no one seemed able to control. For every soul that returned, another fell into darkness. For every miracle of resurrection, there was a corresponding tragedy. Ethan had always believed in balance, in the natural flow of existence. But now, standing at the precipice of this altered world, he could feel the weight of an unfinished cycle pressing down on him. There was no peace, no true resolution. The living and the dead coexisted, yes, but it was a fragile coexistence, born of necessity rather than harmony. People walked through their lives haunted by the shadows of the past, unable to fully embrace the future. The souls who had returned were still tethered to the mortal realm, each with their own unfinished business, their own struggles that had followed them from the other side. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as he pondered how to break the cycle. The knowledge he had uncovered, the resurrection rituals, the sacred flames, all of it had led him to this moment. But none of it had prepared him for the reality of what he now faced, the question that had driven him all this time, the question of whether the cremated could rise again, had given birth to a far greater truth. Life could never be restored to its natural balance until the cycle was complete, until death was truly final. He stood before the ruins of the Temple of Resurgence, the once sacred ground now tainted by the very power it had wielded. The temple had been a place of rebirth, a place where souls were meant to be purified and restored, but instead, it had become a monument to the failure of that mission. The souls that had returned had been forever altered, never truly finding peace, and the living had become trapped in an endless cycle of grief and longing. Ethan knew what needed to be done, but it wasn't a decision he could make lightly. The process to end the cycle was one that required great sacrifice, a sacrifice that would tear apart the very fabric of existence. The power to undo the resurrection, to truly allow death to be final, lay in his hands. But it was a power he had feared from the beginning. To sever the connection between the living and the dead, to destroy the gateway that had allowed souls to return, would cost him everything. But in his heart, Ethan understood. The cycle had to end, or it would consume them all. The unfinished business of the past would never allow the world to move forward unless they broke free from the chains that bound them. He had spent so long searching for answers, but the truth had always been clear. Some cycles weren't meant to be completed. Some things were better left to rest. And so, with a heavy heart and unwavering resolve, Ethan set out to do what must be done to end the cycle. And with it, the world as they knew it. It was the only way to restore balance, to give the living the peace they had longed for, and to allow the dead to finally rest. The air around them had shifted, heavy and thick with the weight of something unspeakable. The veil between the living world and the afterlife, once a distant, imperceptible boundary, had begun to fray. Ethan could feel it in his bones, a strange trembling in the very fabric of existence. It wasn't just a metaphor anymore, this was real. The world as they knew it was on the verge of collapse, teetering on the edge of two realms that were never meant to merge. Ethan's thoughts raced as he watched the tremors of reality ripple through the landscape. In the distance, the sky above the sacred temple had darkened, as if the heavens themselves were preparing for something monumental. The spirits of the dead, those who had returned through resurrection, no longer appeared as they once did. Their presence was less defined, their forms wavering, caught between solidity and intangibility. They had once been anchored by the sacred rites that allowed them to walk among the living, but now they drifted aimlessly, pulled by forces they couldn't comprehend. The disturbances were growing more frequent, and with them, the chaos began to spread. The dead, unable to find their place in the world of the living, began to panic. Souls, still tethered to the material world, clung to the edges of the veil, unwilling to cross over completely. Some wandered aimlessly, their faces twisted in confusion, while others raged against their fate, furious at being denied the peace they had longed for. And yet, the living were not unaffected. There were whispers in the wind, strange occurrences in the night, as if the very atmosphere had become charged with an energy no one could explain. Shadows seemed to flicker in places they shouldn't be, and doors opened by themselves in abandoned houses. People spoke of seeing familiar faces, only to turn around and find them gone, as though the spirits were reaching out, trying to find their way back. Ethan turned to the group, a sense of urgency in his chest. The veil was thinning faster than he had anticipated, and soon it would tear beyond repair. If they didn't act quickly, there would be no stopping the consequences. The living and the dead would be forever trapped in a chaotic loop, unable to find peace, unable to return to their rightful places. Isabella's eyes met his, her expression resolute. "We need to restore balance before it's too late," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. "The only way to fix this is to close the breach, but we can't do it alone. The power to repair the veil lies in the hands of the living, but the will of the dead is just as crucial." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy with the responsibility. He knew that the task ahead would require more than just their knowledge of the resurrection rituals. They would need to understand the delicate balance between life and death, between the realms that had begun to merge. The veil had once been a barrier, a necessary separation. Now, it was a fragile thread, and if they didn't act swiftly, it would snap. They were the last hope for restoring the world to its rightful order. Time was running out. The world had shifted into a state of tense stillness, as if holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Ethan stood at the heart of the fractured veil, the boundary between the living and the dead, staring at the swirling energies that pulsed like a heartbeat in the air. The ground beneath him vibrated, the weight of ancient forces pressing down on him. The souls that wandered, their forms now fleeting and distorted, seemed to sense the urgency of the moment. There was no turning back. Ethan's mind raced as the final realization dawned on him. A price had to be paid. The balance, already teetering on the edge, required a sacrifice, a profound exchange between the living and the dead. It wasn't something he had been prepared for, but there was no avoiding it now. To restore the veil, to mend the tear between realms, one soul must make the ultimate offering. The thought struck him like a blow, as he understood the gravity of the decision he was being forced to make. His gaze shifted toward the altar, the sacred stone that had been the focal point of their journey. It had been there, in the temple of resurgence, that they had uncovered the knowledge of the final act. The sacred flame flickered with a dark intensity, casting eerie shadows that seemed to twist and move of their own accord. The flame was the key, the force that could bind the two worlds once more, but only if the soul that made the sacrifice was pure, willing, and prepared to face the consequences. Ethan turned, the weight of the world heavy in his chest. He could feel the presence of the group behind him, Isabella, Lena, and the others who had stood by his side through every trial. Their faces were pale, etched with the understanding of what had to be done. But it was his choice. His soul would be the one that would tip the scales. He closed his eyes, his thoughts torn between the world he knew and the terrifying uncertainty of what lay beyond. The thought of sacrificing himself, of giving up his connection to life, sent a shiver of fear through him. He had learned so much in his quest about life, death, and the soul, but nothing could prepare him for this moment. If he chose to step forward, he would never return. His name would become another echo in the vast, eternal void between the realms. His soul would become part of something greater, a part of the delicate balance of existence. But the consequences of doing nothing were worse. The world would collapse under the strain of the merging realms. The dead would never find peace, and the living would be trapped in a never-ending cycle. There could be no peace, no future, without this final act of surrender. Ethan knew, with a clarity that cut through the fog of fear, that this was the only way. He had to be the one to make the sacrifice. Stepping forward, he embraced the flame's pull, knowing that in this moment, his soul would either heal the world or condemn it to eternal chaos. The air shimmered with a heavy stillness, as if the earth itself had paused to witness the culmination of everything that had come before. Ethan stood at the edge of the altar, the flame now flickering faintly, as though it too sensed the weight of the moment. Behind him, the others remained silent, their faces worn with the toll of their journey, yet filled with an unspoken understanding. The truth they had uncovered, the truth that had driven them to the edges of existence itself, was no longer a secret, no longer a question of abstract philosophy or speculation. It was a truth that could not be unseen, a revelation that had shattered the very foundations of reality. The hidden truth had always been buried deep within the fabric of life and death, guarded by time, by fear, by power. But now, it lay exposed before the world, revealed not just in whispered fragments or ancient texts, but in the flesh and blood of those who had dared to look beyond the veil. The cremated could rise again, not as they once were, but transformed, reborn through a process that transcended the physical, through purification, renewal, and understanding. It had started as a single question, a query that no one had dared to answer, except in the darkest corners of the world. But now the answer was out, spread like wildfire across the globe. People everywhere would learn of the resurrection that awaited the souls of the cremated, of the delicate balance between life and death that could now be shifted, rewritten. Some would accept it with awe, with wonder at the possibilities it offered. Others would recoil in fear, unable to comprehend the implications of such a profound truth. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as the final judgment unfolded. The souls, those who had passed beyond and those who had returned, gathered in the space between worlds, their forms no longer mere shadows or whispers, but beings of power, of energy, of purpose. The weight of their existence pressed against the very structure of creation itself. Those who were ready to transcend, to move forward into a new understanding of what it meant to live and die, stepped forward. The rest, lost in their confusion, their unwillingness to face the truth, faded into the ether, their presence fading like a dream upon waking. The world, once defined by clear lines between the living and the dead, now stood on the precipice of something new. The veil had thinned, the boundaries blurred. Ethan could feel it in the very air, the pulse of life and death intertwined, the fabric of reality bending and reshaping itself. This was the new understanding. This was the new world. As he looked around at his companions, their faces filled with awe and terror in equal measure, Ethan realized that the real challenge had only just begun. The hidden truth was no longer hidden. It was no longer a question for the few to ponder. It was a truth that all must face. And as the final judgment was passed, the world began to adapt, to evolve, to rewrite its understanding of life and death. The question was no longer whether the cremated could rise again. The question was, what would the world do with that knowledge, now that it had been revealed to all? The world, once familiar and anchored in its old understanding of life and death, had shifted into something unrecognizable, something vast and uncertain. The truth they had uncovered, the truth of resurrection, had done more than simply break the boundaries between life and death. It had created a rift, a new world emerging from the ashes of the old. Now, new guardians were needed, those who would protect this fragile knowledge, ensuring it did not fall into chaos, into the wrong hands, or into darkness again. Ethan stood in the center of it all, the weight of leadership pressing upon him like a cloak made of stone. The responsibility was immense, but he had come to understand, more than ever, that this was the only way forward. The old systems of power and authority had been shattered, and now, in the wake of a new reality, the guardians of this knowledge had to rise. He looked around at those who had been with him from the beginning. Lena, her eyes steady and filled with purpose. Isabella, her presence calm but unwavering. And the others, each one changed by their journey, each one carrying a piece of this new truth. They were the first of a new kind of protector, not bound by the old ways but forged in the fires of resurrection itself. They were no longer just seekers, they were the keepers. The world had not yet fully understood the depth of what had happened. Some still resisted, some still feared what they had learned. But the knowledge was now a seed planted deep in the soil of humanity, and it would grow slowly, steadily, and with it, the responsibility of guiding this new world into balance. Ethan felt the pull of that responsibility, an undeniable current drawing him forward. He had never imagined himself as a leader, but now there was no escaping it. The truth had changed him, reshaped him into someone who could no longer turn away from the task ahead. There would be no turning back from this moment, no way to undo what had been done. As the new guardians gathered around him, there was a quiet understanding among them. They would protect the knowledge, nurture it, and guide others as they learned what it meant to live in a world where the veil between life and death was no longer impenetrable. They would guard the passage between the worlds, ensuring that resurrection was not just a gift, but a responsibility, a sacred trust. Ethan's heart beat with a steady rhythm as he took his place among them. This world, though broken, had been given a second chance, and it was up to them, those who understood the hidden truth, to safeguard it. Together, they would be the guardians of the new world, protectors of the balance between life and death. Ethan had never imagined this life for himself, but now he knew he was ready. The truth had come, and with it, a new era had begun. The air was thick with tension, heavy as if the world itself was bracing for something inevitable. A storm was coming, one unlike any the world had seen before. It was not made of rain or wind, but of fear and uncertainty. A force born from the hearts of those who could not yet accept the truth. They had barely begun to rebuild, to find peace, when a new threat loomed, one that could unravel everything they had fought for. Ethan stood at the edge of a precipice, metaphorically and literally, his eyes scanning the horizon. The winds had shifted, bringing with them whispers of resistance, of factions stirring in the shadows, their voices growing louder by the day. People were afraid. Some saw resurrection as a blessing, but others, those who clung to the old ways, saw it as a curse, a corruption of nature itself. They believed that the cycle of life and death, once disrupted, could never return to its original order. Their fear was not just for themselves, but for all of humanity. The group had made progress, but this new challenge was different. It wasn't just a matter of physical battles or intellectual debates. It was a battle for the soul of humanity. The resurrection had been a spark that ignited hope for some, but it also threatened to shatter the very foundation of society for others. There were whispers of war, of radical movements intent on restoring the old ways, determined to destroy what they saw as the abomination of the new world. Ethan felt it, the cold weight of uncertainty pressing in on him. What if they had made a mistake? What if resurrection was more than humanity was meant to carry? But deep within him, a fire burned, a conviction that they had no choice but to press forward. The truth was out, and it was not just about resurrection, it was about life itself, about understanding the cycle of death and rebirth as part of something greater, something beyond human comprehension. To turn back now would be to deny the very essence of what they had uncovered. Lena, standing beside him, placed a steady hand on his shoulder. She didn't need words. Ethan could see the resolve in her eyes. The group, their allies, were not weak. They had been tested, each of them in their own way. They would stand together, not just to protect what they had learned, but to ensure that the truth was not lost again. To fear and ignorance. The storm would come. It would test them in ways they hadn't imagined. But Ethan knew, without a doubt, that they had the strength to face it. The truth they held was not a gift to be squandered, nor a burden to be cast aside. It was the future, and they would fight for it, no matter the cost. The ground trembled beneath Ethan's feet as the final battle began. It wasn't the kind of fight that could be won with swords or weapons, but with ideas, with the very soul of humanity. Across the horizon, the opposing forces gathered, a faction of zealots who believed the resurrection process was a corruption, an abomination that threatened the natural order. They had one goal: to undo everything the group had fought for, to erase the knowledge that life, death, and resurrection were interconnected in a way that transcended human understanding. Ethan stood with Lena, the others by his side, their faces a mix of determination and sorrow. This was not what they had expected when they set out on their quest. They had hoped for peace, for acceptance, but now the world was divided. On one side were those who embraced the resurrection, who saw it as the next step in human evolution, and on the other, those who feared it, who sought to preserve the ancient boundaries that defined life and death. The forces of resistance were vast, their leaders driven by a fierce belief that their version of reality was the only one that could sustain the world. They had rallied behind the notion that death was sacred, that it was not for mortals to decide who should live and who should die. They believed that meddling with the cycle of life would bring nothing but chaos and suffering, that resurrection would lead to a world teeming with restless souls, forever trapped between realms. As the battle loomed, Ethan's mind raced. He could see both sides, understand the fears that motivated the resistance. He, too, had once stood at the crossroads, uncertain of the truth. But now, after everything he had learned, everything he had witnessed, he could not turn back. Resurrection was not a violation of nature, it was a renewal, a way for souls to evolve, to move beyond the constraints of their previous lives and into something greater. The process had to be safeguarded, yes, but it could not be undone. The price of immortality was not the ultimate goal. It was the understanding of existence itself, a chance to transcend the cycle of suffering. The forces of the living and the dead were now at odds, a tension that could not be resolved through simple compromise. Ethan's voice rang out, calling for peace, for understanding. He urged both sides to see that resurrection was not a threat to life but a chance to give it meaning beyond what was known. But the opposition did not listen. The first strike was made, arrows flew through the air, and chaos erupted as the battle began in earnest. Ethan knew there was only one way to end this. He had to prove, once and for all, that resurrection could not be abused, that it had a purpose beyond the corrupt uses it might be put to. With his heart heavy and his mind clear, he stepped into the fray, not with the intent to destroy, but to protect what was sacred. The final battle was not one of violence, it was one of truth, of conviction, and of sacrifice. And Ethan would do whatever it took to ensure that the cycle of life, death, and rebirth would continue. But with respect, with reverence, and with wisdom. The world had come to a standstill, a heavy silence hanging in the air. Every corner of the earth seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a decision that would determine the future of all existence. The forces of life and death, the living and the resurrected, the dead who had returned and those who still clung to the old ways, each stood at a precipice. The choice was no longer about science or belief, it was about humanity itself. Ethan stood before the world, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He had seen the possibilities of both outcomes. He had witnessed the beauty of resurrection, the return of the lost souls, the chance to right wrongs, to renew, to transcend. He had felt the deep sorrow of those who feared that crossing this boundary might lead to chaos, to imbalance. But more than that, he had come to understand that humanity could no longer live within the narrow confines of its old understanding of life and death. The resurrection process wasn't just a way to bring the dead back, it was a fundamental shift in the very fabric of existence, a rebirth not only for individuals but for the entire world. The choice, though, wasn't his to make alone. It was the choice of humanity as a whole. Would they accept the process and move forward into a future where life and death were no longer fixed, but fluid? Or would they turn back, clinging to what was familiar, even if it meant losing the opportunity to evolve, to change? The leaders of the world gathered in the Grand Council, their faces grim, their voices tense with the weight of their power. They spoke of fear, the fear that resurrection could lead to a world where boundaries no longer held meaning, where the soul's journey was no longer sacred. They spoke of the sanctity of death, of the natural order, of the irreversible nature of the cycle. Yet in their eyes, Ethan saw something more, a flicker of doubt, a glimmer of understanding. They had seen what he had seen. They had witnessed the suffering of those trapped between life and death, the longing of souls who could not move on, the power of resurrection to heal wounds that otherwise could not be healed. It was in this moment that Ethan realized his role. He wasn't just a witness to history. He was a guide. The world needed someone who could show them that the resurrection process, though powerful and terrifying, was a step forward, not a retreat into the past. He spoke softly, but with conviction, his words carrying the weight of all they had learned, all they had fought for. He spoke of the possibilities that lay ahead, of the potential for a world where death no longer held the final word, a world where the boundaries between life and death were not walls, but doors to be opened, explored, and understood. Humanity stood at the crossroads, and with the final, collective breath, they made their choice. The resurrection process would continue, not without challenges, but with the understanding that this new future was theirs to shape. The world would embrace its rebirth, and Ethan, standing at the heart of it, knew that humanity's journey had only just begun. The world had shifted, irrevocably changed, but now it was time for healing. The air, heavy with uncertainty, began to carry a different weight, one of possibility. The souls that had returned, many of them fractured from their long journeys between worlds, had begun to seek their place once more. The living, too, were awakening to a new reality, one that no longer adhered to the rigid lines of life and death. Instead, there was something far more profound taking root, a delicate balance that required nurturing, patience, and understanding. Ethan stood at the center of it all, the responsibility of guiding the world through this turbulent time settling on his shoulders. The knowledge they had uncovered of resurrection, of life's connection to death, of the ways in which the boundaries could be reshaped, was still raw, still unfolding in ways no one could fully predict. But it was also undeniable that there was potential for something beautiful to emerge from the chaos. Peace was not a distant dream. It was a tangible reality waiting to be built, piece by piece, soul by soul. The resurrected souls, those who had once been lost, were not simply returning to the world as they had been. They were different now, transformed by the journey they had undergone. They remembered the lives they had lived, the people they had loved, but they also carried the weight of the abyss they had crossed. The healing would not be immediate. There would be pain and confusion, moments of anger and frustration, as they tried to reconcile their place in a world that had moved on without them. But there was something in their eyes now, something new, something raw that spoke of resilience, of a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. Ethan, too, was healing. The burden of knowledge, the weight of seeing the fragility of existence and the potential for growth had taken its toll. He had questioned everything, from his belief in the afterlife to his very understanding of death itself. But now, standing in the midst of this fragile new world, he realized that his role was not just to hold the knowledge, but to help others embrace it. It was a delicate dance, a process that required empathy and wisdom. His role had become clear. He was not a teacher or a savior, but a guide, someone who could help lead others through the uncertainty, someone who could show them the way forward. As the world began to find its rhythm, Ethan could see the healing taking shape. It was not a sudden dramatic change, but a slow, steady progress, a world learning to coexist with the very thing it had feared most. The resurrected souls found their place again, weaving themselves into the fabric of the living, and the living, in turn, embraced them as part of a new, richer existence. The healing process was still in its infancy, but the seeds of a new world had been planted, and Ethan, standing in the center of it all, knew that he had found his place too, helping to guide the world into the future, one soul at a time. As the years passed, the world began to settle into the reality they had fought so hard to create. The hidden truth, once a whisper in the darkness, had become a foundation for a new era. It was no longer something secret, something forbidden. It was an understanding, a way of life, woven into the fabric of humanity's existence. The resurrection process, once seen as an aberration, had now been embraced as part of the cycle of life. It was not a gift to be taken lightly, but a responsibility, a delicate balance between life and death that would need to be carried forward. Ethan, though now older, he continued to stand at the heart of this new world. His role had evolved from the one who had uncovered the hidden truth to the one who guided its integration into society. He had become a figure not of authority, but of wisdom, a protector of knowledge. He helped to ensure that the teachings of resurrection, of life's true nature, would be passed on with care and reverence. In a world that had been so focused on boundaries, there was now an understanding that life and death were not opposites, but part of the same cycle. Future generations would come to learn the truth, not through hidden scrolls or whispered secrets, but through education, through the stories passed down from the resurrected souls who had once been lost, but now carried with them the experience of both life and death. Children would grow up in a world where the veil between life and the afterlife was no longer feared, but understood. They would be taught that life was not just a fleeting moment, but a journey, and death was not an end, but a transition. The lessons that had once been buried in ancient texts and sacred rituals would be part of their daily lives. But there was a weight to this legacy, a responsibility that weighed heavily on those who carried it. The knowledge of resurrection could not be used recklessly. It could not be treated as a mere tool, a means of returning the lost to the world. It was a sacred act, one that demanded humility, respect, and understanding. The generations that followed would need to be taught not just how to resurrect, but when and why it was necessary. Ethan had done his part. He had helped to lay the foundation for a new world, one where the boundaries between life and death were not just accepted, but embraced. As he looked toward the future, he knew that the legacy of the hidden truth would survive. It would be carried on by those who understood its weight, its significance, and its potential. In this new world, the knowledge would not be lost again. It would live on, passed down through the ages, ensuring that future generations would never forget the delicate balance that had been achieved and the price that had been paid to get there. The world had quieted in a way that Ethan had not expected. The storm of change had passed, and in its wake, there was peace. It was not the peace he had once imagined, a world untouched by suffering or conflict. It was a quieter peace, born from the acceptance of what life and death truly were, interconnected, fragile, and beautiful in their cyclical nature. There were moments when he could not help but look back at all that had transpired, all that had been lost and gained. In those moments, there was always one question that lingered in his mind. Had they truly understood the weight of what they had done? The resurrection process had altered everything, shifting the very foundations of existence. The boundaries between life and death had become blurred, but the question of how far that shift would go remained unanswered. But today, there was a stillness that settled in Ethan's chest, a quiet acceptance of all that had been. It was the sound of something completing its course. A single soul, one he had feared might never return, had finally found its way back. It was his mother. Ethan had not expected it. After all the discoveries, all the steps forward and backward, he had made peace with the idea that some things must remain beyond reach. He had accepted the death of his mother, just as he had accepted the resurrection of others, understanding that some souls, once returned, could not fully reintegrate into the world of the living. But his mother's soul, the one that had haunted him for so long, had returned. It happened quietly, like a breeze. One moment, Ethan was walking through the familiar streets, lost in the haze of time passing, and the next, he was standing before her. She stood just beyond the threshold, a form as familiar as it was foreign. The outline of her shape shimmered, delicate, like a mirage, but it was her. The warmth of her smile, the subtle tilt of her head, everything about her was undeniable. For a moment, Ethan was speechless. He wanted to ask so much about the afterlife, about her journey, about what had changed, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply stepped forward, reaching out a hand. She smiled, her eyes filled with a deep, comforting peace. "I've always been with you," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. And in that instant, Ethan understood. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth had been completed. His mother, once lost, had returned not in the way he had imagined, but in a way that made sense. She had found peace. The world, too, was finding its own peace in the wake of the resurrection. Ethan knew that the journey was not over. There would always be questions, always uncertainties. But for now, for this moment, he could rest. The final soul had returned, and with it, the promise of balance had been fulfilled. The world, once fractured by the reverberations of life and death, now seemed whole again, its rhythm slow and steady, like the steady beat of a heart. The resurrection process had not only altered humanity's understanding of existence, but had deepened their connection to something much larger, something beyond the veil. Yet, despite all the answers they had found, Ethan knew that the answers themselves were only pieces of a larger puzzle. He stood on a quiet hill, looking down at the town that had once felt so distant, so different from the world he had once known. The bustling streets, the quiet homes, all seemed to breathe in unison, as if they too had been reborn. The air was thick with the scent of earth, of life, of everything beginning anew. It was a feeling that had become almost sacred, a sense of reverence for all that had come before and all that was still to come. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting an amber glow across the landscape, Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the journey he had undertaken, to the many souls he had encountered, to the revelations that had reshaped everything he once thought he knew. He had borne witness to the deepest depths of both life and death, and had seen the transformations that occurred when the boundaries between them began to blur. What had seemed like an impossibility, resurrection, the return of the dead, was now the fabric of reality itself. And yet, there was one thing Ethan had learned above all else. The chain of life, death, and resurrection was unbroken. No matter how many cycles passed, no matter how many souls came and went, there was always a continuation, a thread weaving its way through the fabric of existence. It was a chain that had no beginning and no end, always stretching forward, never faltering. He thought of the souls who had once been lost to time, the souls who had returned only to find themselves in a world forever changed. Their resurrection had been an awakening not just for them, but for humanity as a whole. It had proven that life was not an end, but a constant flow, a river that never ceased to move. Ethan glanced around, the weight of everything he had witnessed pressing into him. There was still much to learn, much to understand, but there was a peace in knowing that he was not alone in this journey. The world was alive with stories, with souls, with the unbroken chain that had now bound them all together. And so, as the first stars began to glimmer in the sky, Ethan took a deep breath and walked forward. There was no destination, no final answer, but he knew that whatever lay ahead, the chain would never break. It would continue, unyielding, carrying them all along the eternal path. Ethan sat quietly beneath the canopy of ancient trees, their leaves whispering in the evening wind. The world around him had changed so much in such a short time, yet the stillness of the forest felt familiar, grounding him in a way that the chaos of the past had not. The paths he had walked through dusty libraries, sacred sites, and the very heart of the underworld had all led to one undeniable truth. Death, life, and resurrection were far more intertwined than he had ever imagined. The truth that had once been a distant, abstract question now lay before him, clear and undeniable. The cremated souls had risen, not as mere echoes, but as something entirely new. Their return had not been without pain, without struggle, but it had also brought with it a profound awakening. They had shown humanity a path beyond the veil, a way to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, to transcend the limitations of flesh. And yet, in their resurrection, there had been costs personal and collective that no one had fully anticipated. In those final moments before the world's great reckoning, Ethan had witnessed the balance between life and death tip, had seen the frail line that separated them begin to fray. He had borne witness to the souls who struggled, who found their place in the world of the living once again, and to those who had fallen back into the darkness, unable to reintegrate into the cycle. The consequences of their return had revealed an uncomfortable truth. Not all souls were meant to return, and not all of them would be able to find peace in their resurrection. Some had been irreparably changed by their time beyond the living world. But there was another part of this truth, something he had not fully understood until now. Life was not simply about existing, it was about purpose, growth, and transformation. The very process of death and resurrection was an opportunity for evolution, for spiritual renewal. It was not a cycle to be feared or manipulated, but embraced. As he reflected on his own journey, he recognized the delicate balance between the two realms, the living and the dead, and the responsibility of those who sought to disrupt or redefine it. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the memories of those who had returned wash over him. He thought of the souls he had met, the ones who had found their peace, and those who were still searching. He thought of his mother, whose cremation had set him on this journey, and of the countless souls who had long been forgotten. In the quiet of the moment, he realized that perhaps the greatest lesson had been one of acceptance. As the stars began to fill the sky above, Ethan allowed himself a moment of stillness, of reflection. The world would continue to turn. Life would persist, and the dead would find their place. But now, in this quiet moment, he could finally rest, knowing that he had uncovered the truth, one that transcended time, death, and all the barriers in between. Ethan stood on the edge of the cliff, looking out over the vast expanse of the world that had once felt so unyielding, so fixed in its course. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, the sun just beginning to dip below the edge of the earth, casting long shadows across the land. It was a new world, one that had been forged by the revelations, the trials, and the sacrifices of the past. But despite the quiet beauty of the evening, Ethan knew that the road ahead would not be without its challenges. The resurrection process had irrevocably altered the fabric of existence. The veil between the living and the dead had thinned, and humanity now stood at the threshold of something far greater than they had ever dared imagine. Souls who had once been lost had returned, and with them came new questions, new dilemmas. The balance between life and death had been restored, at least for now, but there were still fractures, still uncertainties that loomed on the horizon. He thought about all that had come before, the discovery of the hidden truth, the trials, the battles, the choices that had shaped the world's future. There had been moments when it seemed as though everything was unraveling, when the weight of the knowledge they carried threatened to crush them. But through it all, Ethan had learned the value of patience, the need for wisdom in the face of overwhelming power, and the responsibility that came with the gift of resurrection. But now, as he stood at the precipice of this new age, he understood that their work was far from over. The world would need guidance, and he would be one of those who would help chart its course. Humanity had been given the opportunity to redefine what it meant to live and die, to understand the cycles of life in a way they never had before. But with that knowledge came great risk. The temptation to manipulate life and death, to push the boundaries further, would always be present. There were those who would seek to exploit the process, to twist it for their own purposes. The line between creation and destruction was thin, and there were many who would try to cross it. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the world settling on his shoulders. He had a responsibility now, not just to those who had returned, but to the generations yet to come. He would need to stand watch, to ensure that the knowledge they had uncovered was used wisely, that the lessons learned through so much suffering would not be lost. He would guide the new guardians, the ones who would take on the mantle of protecting the balance between life and death. As the stars began to twinkle above, Ethan felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but he no longer feared it. He had faced the deepest mysteries of existence, and though many questions remained, he knew he was ready to walk the path that lay before him. The world had been given a second chance, and in that chance, Ethan knew, would come not only the answers to their greatest questions, but the challenges that would shape humanity's future. Ethan sat quietly, the weight of everything that had transpired settling deeply within him. The world was forever changed, yet the most profound shift had occurred inside himself. In his hands, he held no more books or sacred texts, no more symbols or ancient artifacts. Instead, he held a new understanding, one that had been waiting for him all along, buried beneath layers of doubt, fear, and confusion. The truth was not something to be discovered in forgotten temples or whispered in the shadows of hidden societies. It was something far deeper, far simpler, and it had always been within him. As the sun set, casting a golden hue over the horizon, Ethan's thoughts turned inward. All the knowledge they had uncovered, all the trials they had endured, had been steps in the direction of realizing that death, resurrection, and life were not just physical states. They were spiritual experiences, intricate processes that transcended the boundaries of the body. These were not separate events, but parts of a larger cycle, one that connected the living, the dead, and the reborn in a never-ending dance of transformation. He had once believed that death was an end, a conclusion to the journey, but now he understood that it was merely a passage, an evolution of the soul. Resurrection was not about returning to life as it had once been, but about transcending the limitations of the physical world, shedding one form to become something greater, something wiser. It was not about defying nature, but aligning with it, understanding the cycles that governed existence itself. The true secret was that everything, the resurrection, the cycles of life and death, the very nature of being was a continuous, evolving experience. It was all intertwined, a part of a greater tapestry that could never truly be understood with the mind alone. It could only be grasped through the heart, through the spirit, through the acceptance of the unknown. It was not something to be controlled or mastered, but something to be felt, experienced, and respected. Ethan's gaze lifted toward the sky, where the first stars of the evening had begun to appear. They were quiet, distant, yet undeniably present. Just as the stars had always been there, the truth had always been there, waiting for him to open his eyes. He had spent so much of his life searching outward, seeking answers in the world around him, but now he knew that the most important discoveries were made within. He had been running toward an external truth when, all along, it had been his own soul that needed to awaken. As the night deepened, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. The burden of knowledge had not destroyed him. It had transformed him. He now understood that the journey never truly ended. Life, death, and resurrection were all part of the same ongoing process, a spiritual evolution that could never be fully completed, but only ever deepened. And in that realization, he found the greatest truth of all, that the answers had always been inside him.